It was a night where the air itself seemed heavy with menace. The kind of night where the fog rolled in from the river and clung to the ground like a living thing, twisting streetlights into sickly halos of yellow, reflecting off wet asphalt and puddles. The wind howled through the empty streets of the small town of Millfield, rattling the shutters and shaking the branches of the few skeletal trees that lined the sidewalks. Most residents were already locked away in their homes, lights off, curtains drawn, as though the gloom outside had seeped through the walls and demanded obedience. Alex was not one of them. He had just finished his late shift at the convenience store on Main Street, the one that never seemed to close because the owner, a perpetually nervous man named Frank, was convinced someone would always want a pack of cigarettes or a soda at 2 in the morning. The store itself was quiet now, stocked shelves gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, the hum of the cooler the only constant sound. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening had finally broken. Rain pelted the windows, and the wind rattled the sign that hung precariously above the front door. Alex locked up, grabbed his jacket from the hook behind the counter, and stepped into the night. The first thing he noticed was how empty the street was. No cars, no other pedestrians, only the echo of his boots hitting the wet pavement. A thin mist had begun to settle over the street, reducing the buildings to dark, looming shapes. Normally, he didn't mind walking home. It was only a few miles, mostly along quiet residential streets. But tonight felt different. The fog made everything seem distorted, almost unreal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Halfway down Maple Avenue, he heard it. A faint, dragging sound behind him. At first, he thought it was just debris being moved by the wind, but it had a rhythm, deliberate and measured, matching his steps. He quickened his pace, telling himself it was just his imagination, that late nights always made the mind play tricks. But then the sound quickened too, matching his faster pace. Alex turned a corner and the streetlight flickered violently before going out, plunging him into near darkness. The rain intensified, blinding him momentarily, and when he looked up, he saw a figure at the far end of the street. It was tall, unnaturally so, dressed in dark, wet clothing that clung to its frame. It stood perfectly still, but the moment Alex's eyes met it, it began to move. Not walk, but glide. It covered the distance between them faster than any human could, and the air seemed to grow colder as it approached. Alex's heart slammed in his chest. He turned and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps, or something like footsteps, echoed behind him, sometimes in sync, sometimes erratic, like the presence itself was toying with him. He reached the edge of town and the small bridge over Mill Creek, the one that always creaked under even the lightest load. His apartment wasn't far from here, a cramped studio in an old building whose paint peeled in layers, giving it the smell of damp wood and decay. He glanced back once more, and in the flickering light of the bridge lamp, he saw it again, the figure standing in the middle of the road, head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if it were examining him. Alex stumbled over the last few steps, tripping and hitting the wet pavement hard. Pain radiated through his arm and knee, but fear overrode it. He scrambled to his feet, sliding the last few yards toward the entrance of his building. He fumbled with his keys, hands shaking violently, and finally pushed the door open. The lobby was dark, the old bulb above the desk flickering weakly. He bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, never once looking back, and finally slammed the door to his apartment, locking it with shaking hands. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The sound outside had stopped. The rain still pounded the windows, the wind still howled around the building, but the figure seemed gone. Alex leaned against the door, trying to calm himself, trying to convince himself it had been a trick of the fog and the storm. But then he heard it, a scratching at the window, low, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. He froze. His apartment was on the second floor. No one could be outside the window, not in this weather. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low, rasping whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly, more like a hiss that carried in the wind. "I see you." Alex's breath caught. He grabbed the nearest object, a chair from the kitchen, and swung toward the window. The rain poured down, the street below barely visible through the sheets of water, but the window pane itself was streaked with what looked like handprints. Long, thin, almost skeletal, and in one corner, the fog seemed to twist unnaturally, forming a shape that resembled the figure he had seen on the street. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and pressed himself against the far wall. The whispering continued, coming now from all directions, the windows, the vents, even the walls themselves. It filled the room, pressing against his eardrums, making his vision swim. Shadows in the corners began to stretch and twist, moving independently of the weak light from the flickering bulb. Alex knew he had to get out. He grabbed his coat and keys and ran back down the stairs, ignoring the pain in his leg. The lobby was empty, but the front door resisted him, as if it were part of the building's conspiracy to trap him. Finally, with a surge of panic, he threw his shoulder against it, and it burst open. The street outside was empty again, but the fog had thickened, turning the familiar surroundings into a maze of gray shapes. He ran blindly, taking streets he didn't recognize, following the faint glow of distant lights, any signs of life. But no matter how far he ran, the sense of being watched didn't dissipate. Sometimes he caught glimpses in the fog, a figure standing at a corner, a shadow slipping between buildings, a pair of glowing eyes watching from an alleyway. Every time he looked directly, it vanished, but he could feel its gaze burning into him. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed meaningless in the fog. Eventually, Alex found himself on the outskirts of town, near the abandoned mill that everyone said was haunted. He remembered the stories from childhood, people disappearing there, strange sounds at night, shadows that moved against the wind. He didn't care. He needed a place to hide, somewhere the figure might not follow. He slipped inside the mill through a broken side door. The air was damp, musty, filled with the scent of decay. The wooden floors creaked under his weight, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, eager and hungry. He pressed himself against a support beam, trying to control his breathing. He told himself that if he stayed perfectly still, the figure might not find him. The hours dragged on. Every creak, every whisper of wind made him flinch. At some point, he fell into a fitful, terrified sleep, only to be awakened by the sound of footsteps inside the mill. Slow, deliberate, echoing across the cavernous space. Alex held his breath, counting them, trying to locate the source. The fog that had seeped inside the mill was thicker now, swirling around his feet, curling up around the support beams, shaping itself into forms he couldn't name. And then he saw it. The figure emerging from the mist, taller than ever, moving as if it was gliding across the floor. Its face, or the lack of one, was turned toward him, and in the weak moonlight streaming through broken windows, he could see the faintest suggestion of a smile. Alex tried to run, but the floor seemed to shift beneath him. Boards warped, shadows reaching out to grab his legs, tripping him, throwing him to the ground. The figure advanced, slow and unrelenting, a dark presence that consumed the light around it. The whispers became voices, hundreds of them, all speaking in a language he couldn't understand, pressing into his mind, twisting his thoughts, making his head throb. He scrambled toward a side exit, the fog swirling around him, whispering, laughing. The figure followed, moving through the mist as though it were solid, as though the building itself had become its body. Alex stumbled into the rain outside, coughing and shaking, lungs burning. The fog clung to him like a wet sheet, and he could still feel the presence behind him. He didn't stop running. He didn't look back. The town had changed, the familiar streets now alien and treacherous, filled with corners where shadows waited, where the figure could appear at any moment. He ran through fields, over fences, across empty roads, until finally, exhausted, soaked to the bone, he collapsed in an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town. The storm had passed. The fog was thinning. The first rays of dawn painted the world in gray light. Alex leaned against the cold concrete wall, shivering, soaked, trembling with exhaustion and terror. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. The whispers had faded with the night, but the sense of being watched remained. Days passed. Weeks. Alex avoided going home. He moved from motel to motel, from town to town, always keeping to the shadows, always watching for the figure, the presence that had claimed him that night. Friends called, texted, worried. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew the truth. It wasn't going to let him go. Not ever. He learned to survive in the edges of the world, avoiding the night, avoiding darkness wherever he could. But every rainy night, every flickering streetlight, every shadow stretching longer than it should, it was there, watching, waiting. patient. And Alex knew deep down that it wasn't just a figure, not just a presence. It was something older, something that had been waiting for him, and once it found him, there would be nowhere left to run. Even now, years later, he moves quietly through the towns along the eastern states, always at the edges, never staying in one place long enough to be trapped. He sleeps with lights on, windows open only enough for the faintest breeze, and he never, ever ventures into fog. But sometimes, on the gloomiest nights, when the wind howls through the streets and the fog rolls in thick and fast, he swears he can hear it. The faintest drag of movement behind him, the low hiss of words he cannot understand, the unmistakable tilt of a head that should not bend that way. And he knows he will never be free. Story the end. The rain had been falling for hours, relentless and merciless, turning the winding back roads of rural Vermont into slick ribbons of black water that reflected the occasional flicker of lightning. It was the kind of storm that seemed alive, heavy with purpose, pressing down on the land with a weight that made every sound sharper, every shadow darker. Cars had long since disappeared from the roads, leaving the landscape empty, except for the wind that whipped through the bare trees and the occasional howl of a distant animal. The hollow of the hills swallowed every noise, leaving the world muted, except for the steady, insistent drumming of rain against rooftops and leaves. James Whitaker's truck struggled through the flood of water pooling along the narrow lanes, headlights cutting through the dark like knives. He had left the city behind, desperate to get back to the safety of his small family home, but even as the familiar outline of his childhood property emerged from the curtain of rain, unease gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the storm had brought more than just water and wind with it. The trees swayed unnaturally, almost as if they were bending to watch him pass, and he instinctively kept the windows rolled up, even though the air inside the truck was hot and heavy. The house stood at the end of a long, rutted driveway, a squat, weathered structure with peeling paint and sagging eaves. It had always felt a little foreboding, even in sunlight, but tonight it seemed alive in a way that made James's skin crawl. He killed the truck's engine and listened. At first, only the rain, pounding against the roof and pooling along the gutters. Then came the faintest sound, almost imperceptible beneath the storm, a tapping, steady and deliberate, echoing from the back of the house. He shook his head, telling himself it was probably just a branch blown by the wind, but the rational thought offered little comfort. James climbed out of the truck, boots sinking into the sodden earth. The rain drenched him immediately, plastering his hair to his forehead, soaking through his coat. He grabbed the flashlight from the truck bed, flicking it on and sweeping the beam across the yard. The beam caught the skeletal shapes of the garden, the old swing set twisted by time, and the shadows of trees that seemed to lean closer than they should. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. The tapping had stopped. He tried to relax, telling himself it was just his imagination. Inside the house, the air was thick and musty, smelling of old wood and damp plaster. James flicked on the lights in the entryway, though they did little to penetrate the gloom. Every room seemed heavier than he remembered, the furniture coated in a fine layer of dust, despite his mother's insistence that it had been cleaned recently. He called out, expecting a reply from his sister or anyone who might be home, but the house was empty. That made sense. He had known they were out of town, but the feeling of being watched intensified. He set down the flashlight and began to make his way to the kitchen, footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. A sudden bang from upstairs made him freeze, heart thudding painfully in his chest. The sound was like a chair tipping over, then the shuffle of feet across the floor. James's pulse quickened, and he felt the first real spike of fear. He wasn't alone. Whoever, or whatever, was up there had been moving around silently until the storm drowned out their presence. He reached for the phone on the counter, only to find it dead, the screen black. No signal, no power, just him in the house, and the storm that pressed against the windows like a living thing. The upstairs hallway stretched into darkness, the dim glow from the entryway fading as he ascended the stairs. James gripped the railing, each step groaning under his weight. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, and the house responded in kind, the walls shivering, the floor vibrating slightly, the windows rattling in their frames. Then came the whispering. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, like wind through the cracks, but unmistakably human. Low, sibilant murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. He spun, flashlight sweeping the hallway, catching only shadows, furniture, and peeling wallpaper. His rational mind tried to cling to explanations. The storm, the wind, maybe rats in the attic. But the words themselves grew clearer, forming into phrases he could almost comprehend, half-formed threats that dissolved before they fully reached him. "Don't move," one voice whispered. Another followed, overlapping. "It's watching." James's heart pounded in his ears. He should have run, he knew that, but his legs refused to obey. Something about the darkness paralyzed him, made every movement feel sluggish and heavy. The shadows shifted. One of them stretched toward him, impossibly tall, limbs bending at angles that made no sense. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in the pitch black. He stumbled backward, hands outstretched, and felt the floorboards give under a weight that wasn't his own. Panic set in, raw and unrelenting. He turned to descend the stairs, but another sound stopped him. A whisper, right in his ear. A breath so cold it burned the skin. "You shouldn't be here." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was suffocating. James wanted to scream, to flee, but the sound of the storm outside had vanished in an instant, replaced by a terrifying silence. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. The shadows grew longer, denser, pressing in from the corners. He backed into a wall, fingers scraping along the plaster, searching for anything to defend himself with. That's when he saw the figure. It was just a silhouette, dark against the shadows, but he could feel it before he saw it. Malevolent, patient, impossibly still. Its head tilted slightly, as though studying him, and though he couldn't see its face, James could feel the intensity of its gaze burning into his mind. He took a step back, and the figure moved, fluid and unnatural, almost sliding across the floor. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get outside, but the stairs seemed farther than ever, as if the house itself stretched to trap him. James's breathing became ragged. He remembered the old cellar door, the one in the kitchen that led down to the dark, musty basement. Something inside him, some desperate spark of survival, pushed him toward it. He swung the door open, half expecting the figure to follow. Darkness enveloped him, thick and suffocating, smelling of mold and rot. He descended slowly, each step creaking under his weight, praying the figure wouldn't appear behind him. The stairs seemed endless, and by the time he reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered weakly, casting trembling light over the walls. The basement was empty, or so he thought. But the shadows here were different, denser, clinging to the corners, stretching along the walls like living things. He could hear the whispering again, closer this time, circling him. His eyes strained to see, to find a way out, to find anything that could explain this nightmare. That's when he saw movement in the far corner where the light barely reached. Something crouched there, low to the ground, limbs twisted. Its eyes, or the semblance of eyes, glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. It tilted its head at him, and a slow, deliberate smile curved its unseen mouth. James bolted, diving for the stairs, slipping in the muck of the basement floor. The thing followed, silent, patient, gliding over the ground in ways that defied logic. He reached the top of the stairs, gasping, only to find the kitchen empty. But then he realized the doors were no longer where they had been. The layout of the house had changed. Walls seemed to have shifted, rooms elongated or compressed. Panic set in fully now. The house was no longer a house. It was a trap, a labyrinth designed to confuse and terrify. He ran through the rooms, each step echoing unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming half-words, twisted sentences. "You cannot leave. You belong. Stay." The shadows twisted into shapes, forms that were almost human, almost alive, crawling along the walls and ceilings. He slammed into doors, found them locked or vanishing entirely. The storm outside was silent now, replaced by an unnatural stillness that pressed down on him like a physical weight. Hours seemed to pass. Time had no meaning. The thing that followed him never attacked outright. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was a torment, gnawing at his mind, bending reality around him. James had begun to hallucinate, seeing faces in the wallpaper, hands reaching from the floorboards, whispers in the wood. He couldn't tell what was real, what was part of the house's malevolence. And then, in a hallway that shouldn't exist, he saw the end of it all. a door that opened onto nothing but blackness, an infinite void. He felt drawn to it, pulled as though by gravity. Step by step, he moved closer, the whispers crescendoing into a chorus of warning and invitation. And then, with a final, terrifying pull, he stepped through, and the house swallowed him whole. Outside, the storm began anew. Rain pounded the ground, lightning split the sky, and the wind howled through the hollow, but there was no trace of James Whitaker. The house, the driveway, the roads, all were empty, untouched, as if no one had been there at all. But inside the shadows of Cedar Hollow, in the spaces where reality thinned, he remained, watching, waiting, a part of the darkness that had claimed him. The Hollow never forgot, and those who ventured too close could sometimes hear the faintest whisper on a stormy night, "You shouldn't be here." And so the legend of the Whitaker house grew, whispered among locals and travelers alike. Stories of people vanishing in storms, of shadows moving on their own, of whispers that lured the unwary. No one dared to enter, yet the house still stood, a dark sentinel in the hollow, patient and eternal. Storms would come and go, the rain would fall, but the darkness within remained, hungry and vigilant. And somewhere inside, James Whitaker still ran, still screamed silently in the unending night, bound to the malevolence that had chosen him, unable to escape, unable to die. The shadows waited for the next storm, for the next traveler drawn by the hollow's silent promise. The darkness was patient, the hollow was eternal. And the night would never end. Story the end. The rain had been falling all day, a relentless drizzle that turned the streets into slick mirrors reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. Autumn had arrived early that year, and the wind carried a chill that crept through every layer of clothing, gnawing at skin and bone alike. In a small, almost forgotten town in the Midwest, the sort of place where everyone knows your name but also your secrets, a storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the kind of darkness that clung to old houses and empty alleyways. Maggie Evans had moved to this town only a month prior. She had taken a modest job at the local library, mostly because it allowed her to be surrounded by quiet and books, both of which she preferred over the chatter and chaos of city life. But something about the town had unsettled her from the start. The odd looks people gave her as she walked past, the way the trees along the main street seemed to lean toward her, the strange hum that sometimes rose from the earth after heavy rains. She chalked it up to nerves, to being a stranger, but deep down she felt like she had walked into a place that remembered her before she even arrived. The night started quietly. Maggie was alone in her small apartment on the second floor of an old brick building at the edge of town. The walls were thin, and the pipes groaned like old men in pain whenever someone flushed a toilet or ran water. Tonight, she was curled up on the couch with a blanket pulled around her shoulders, a mug of tea warming her hands, and a half-finished novel lying open on her lap. The wind rattled the window panes, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the room in stark, fleeting bursts, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Shadows that looked too human to be just furniture. Around 11, the power went out. The apartment fell into a suffocating darkness, the kind that feels like it's pressing against your skin. Maggie's first instinct was to check the circuit breaker, but as she rose from the couch, she realized the entire block was dark. The storm had knocked out the lines. Sighing, she grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight and tried to reassure herself that this was normal, that storms caused outages all the time. But as her phone cast a dim glow, she noticed something unsettling. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway outside her apartment. She lived alone. She knew she did. Her heart thumped in her chest. She told herself it was probably a neighbor, someone checking on the outage, but the hallway outside was empty when she peered through the peephole. No one there. The footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than the storm itself. Maggie shook her head and tried to laugh at herself, thinking she was letting fear get the better of her. She went back to the couch, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Something was watching her. She could feel it. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows with a force that made the apartment feel as though it could lift off the ground. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold, a scratching, like nails against wood, coming from the back door. She didn't have a back door. Her apartment was on the second floor, but the sound was coming from somewhere within the building. She froze, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, closer, moving toward her door. Panic surged through her. She wanted to call 911, but her phone was almost dead, the battery dwindling like sand slipping through fingers. She backed toward the corner of the room, clutching a heavy book she had grabbed from the shelf as if it could serve as a weapon. Then she heard a whisper, soft, almost inaudible at first, but unmistakable. Her name. Maggie. It was drawn out, guttural, a sound that didn't belong to any human voice she had ever heard. She swung the phone in the direction of the sound, and the light caught something in the hallway. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of the doorway. Its face was hidden, swallowed by shadows, but Maggie felt its gaze, sharp and hungry, pinning her in place. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, yet Maggie could feel it advancing. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, and each step it took didn't make a sound. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind her, and the phone slipped from her hand, spinning across the floor and casting the hallway in a brief, flickering light. When the light hit the figure again, it was closer, too close. She could see its eyes then, or rather, the absence of eyes, two hollow voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. It grinned, and the sound was a high-pitched squeal, like metal being scraped on stone, resonating in her skull. Maggie screamed, but no sound came out. She turned, trying to escape, only to find that the hallway stretched impossibly long, twisting in ways that defied the architecture of the building. Doors that shouldn't exist opened and closed, whispering her name in voices she recognized, her mother's, her childhood friends, voices from dreams she had long forgotten. Each voice promised something, each one threatening her. She ran blindly, the floorboards creaking beneath her, each step echoing like a death knell. The storm outside roared, but inside there was no sound but the whispers, the laughter, and the scraping of nails across the walls. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the hallucination, or perhaps it wasn't, ended. Maggie found herself back in her apartment, the door closed and the storm raging outside. Her heart was racing, sweat dripping down her back. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees, and tried to calm herself. It had been a nightmare, she told herself. Just a nightmare. But then she noticed the window. The glass was smeared with something dark, streaked in a pattern that looked unnervingly like fingers. The next day, she tried to rationalize everything. Storms played tricks on the mind. Stress made the imagination vivid. But the black smears on the window, now dried and unmovable, suggested something else, something she couldn't explain. And that night, when she tried to sleep, she heard the whispers again, soft and patient this time, coming from the darkness outside her bedroom door. She didn't sleep that night, nor the next, nor the night after. The town seemed to shift around her. Familiar streets led her to places she didn't recognize. The trees leaned closer when she walked by, their branches clawing at her jacket. And always, always, the whispers. Her name. Commands, threats, promises of pain. The world outside the storm seemed alive, watching, and somehow connected to the building where she lived. And every night, the darkness in her apartment grew, pooling in corners, thickening like ink until it was almost solid. She tried to leave town, driving down the highways at dawn, hoping the sunlight would bring relief. But the roads looped back, as if the storm and the darkness had made the landscape a trap. Every town sign she passed was either wrong or missing. Gas stations and diners that should have been there vanished when she looked directly at them. Her phone had no signal. The world was unspooling around her, unraveling into the same oppressive, malevolent gloom that had overtaken her apartment. Weeks passed, or maybe it was months. Time lost its meaning. Maggie started seeing figures in the corner of her vision, always just beyond reach, always silent. Her reflection no longer looked like her. Her hair had turned a dull gray, her skin pallid and drawn. She spoke to no one, for the few people she passed on the streets seemed to melt into the shadows if she tried to approach them. And when she returned home, because she always returned, the black stains had grown. Not just on the window, but along the walls, creeping across the floor, pooling beneath the door like a living thing. One night, as the storm raged with unprecedented fury, Maggie realized she was not alone in her apartment. Not just the shadows or the figure from the hallway, but something else. Something that moved with intention, that filled the space with cold and quiet menace. It whispered again, closer now, right behind her. She dared not turn, knowing that to do so would be to see the impossible, the monstrous. The voice was not just calling her name now. It was speaking directly into her mind, telling her things she could not forget, things she didn't want to know. Names, dates, secrets, truths too awful to carry. And with each word, the air grew heavier. The walls seemed to bend inward, the darkness pressing closer. Maggie ran, or tried to, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. The apartment stretched again, twisting. She screamed, finally producing sound, but it echoed back distorted, mocking. She tripped over her own hands and knees, scrambling toward the window, hoping for escape. The glass was like water beneath her fingers, rippling with shadows that reached up to pull her in. She heard laughter, high and shrill, and then silence. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose pale and weak, but Maggie Evans was gone. Her apartment was empty, except for the black stains that had hardened into permanent, unexplainable shapes on the walls and floor. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no screams, no sounds of struggle. Only the door to her apartment slightly ajar and the oppressive sense that the building itself had swallowed someone whole. Days later, the landlord came to check on her and found nothing but a faint outline in the dust on the living room floor, an imprint of a person sitting, hunched as if waiting for something. Nothing else. The town, as always, carried on. New residents moved in, oblivious to the history of the building. But some nights, when the wind carries a certain chill and the trees lean too close, locals swear they hear a woman's voice whispering through the streets. Not calling for help, but repeating her name over and over, warning anyone who will listen, don't stay, don't stay, don't stay. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't just fall, it assaulted. Sheets of water slammed against the windows of the old Victorian house on the outskirts of Millersville, a town that had long been forgotten by most maps and travelers. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows over puddles that reflected jagged streaks of lightning. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of wet wood and mildew, and the faint hum of the radiator did little to comfort Mara as she paced the narrow hallway, clutching her coat tightly around her. She'd moved here a month ago, chasing isolation, thinking it would help her finish the manuscript she'd been struggling with for the last year. She hadn't expected the house, or the night, to be so oppressive. The storm had started that morning, turning the usually picturesque roads into ribbons of mud and leaves, the trees bowing and cracking under the relentless wind. Mara's neighbor, an old man named Dean, had warned her when she first arrived. "This house, it's got a history," he'd said, voice quivering like the candle flames in the windows of his own home. "Storms like tonight, they make it hungry. It watches." She hadn't believed him. Nobody did. And yet, as the hours dragged on, the house seemed to groan and shift around her, its floorboards creaking like bones underfoot. She tried to distract herself with her writing, but the storm had a rhythm that seeped into her mind. Every crack of thunder felt deliberate, every flash of lightning illuminating a corner of the room that she could swear hadn't been there before. She sat at her desk, typing on her laptop, but the words refused to form. Her eyes kept drifting to the windows, expecting to see something she couldn't name, some dark shape lurking just beyond the rain-soaked glass. It started with small sounds at first, a whisper of movement in the attic, barely audible over the pounding rain. Mara told herself it was the wind, or maybe the old house settling. But when the whispering turned into shuffling, slow, deliberate footsteps across the ceiling above her, it became impossible to ignore. She froze, heart hammering. The steps stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence of the storm. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. Nothing answered. Only the house responded, a low moan that vibrated through the walls, through the floor, like the building itself was alive. Mara stood, gripping the edge of her desk. Her rational mind insisted it was nothing, that she was imagining things, that the storm had unhinged her nerves. But instinct whispered that she was not alone. She fetched a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam trembling in her hands as she climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder the higher she went, and the shadows thickened, clinging to her like cobwebs. The attic door creaked open and she swept the flashlight around the room. Dust motes floated in the beam, and old furniture lay draped in white sheets, like specters frozen in mid-motion. And then she saw it, a dark figure standing at the far end of the attic. It didn't move like a person. Its outline was distorted, as if the shadows themselves had gathered into a shape, and yet she could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and the beam rolled across the floor, landing on the figure's face, or where a face should have been. It was featureless, an abyss that seemed to pull the light toward it, leaving the corners of the room in unnerving darkness. Mara fled down the stairs, not daring to look back. She locked herself in the bedroom, pressing herself against the door, listening. The footsteps were now in the hallway, slow, methodical, moving closer. The house groaned as if it were shifting, rearranging itself around her, and the whispers began again, low and guttural, repeating words she couldn't understand, but that made her skin crawl. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning in the storm. Mara didn't dare sleep. She huddled under the covers, blanket wrapped tightly around her, the flashlight at her side. The rain pounded against the roof, each crash sounding like a hammer striking metal, and every lightning flash revealed brief, horrifying glimpses of movement outside her window. She thought she saw shadows, figures, darting between the trees, closer with each strike of lightning. Around midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the storm outside seemed louder, angrier. Mara's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in absolute blackness. She could hear breathing now, not her own, low and deliberate, moving through the room. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. But it didn't end. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, like something was pressing down on her chest. A knock sounded at the bedroom door, soft at first, then insistent. Mara froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The knocking continued, each hit of the knuckles echoing through the walls. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The door rattled as if something on the other side was testing it, trying to break through. Suddenly it stopped. Silence, heavy and suffocating, filled the room. Mara dared to breathe again. Then a whisper, barely audible, came from the hallway. Mara. Her blood ran cold. She had not told anyone her name, had not spoken it aloud since moving in. The voice was soft but layered, as if more than one entity spoke at once, and yet it was intimate, knowing, familiar. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching the blanket over her head. The whisper grew louder, closer, circling the room, punctuated by faint, scratching sounds on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She remembered the old man's words, "Storms like tonight, they make it hungry. It watches." The house was hungry, and now it had found her. Mara realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't random. She hadn't been chosen. She had invited it in when she moved into the house, thinking isolation would help her creativity. And now creativity had nothing to do with it. Survival did. The knocking returned, this time accompanied by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the hallway floor. It circled the bedroom, stopping at the door, then moving along the walls, over the ceiling, everywhere at once. Mara couldn't tell where it was or if it was even corporeal. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she knew the house was a trap. The exit, the stairs, the windows, they all seemed further away than they should have been. The storm outside became part of the house's voice, the wind howling like it was alive, the rain hammering the windows like fists, and within it all, the whispers and footsteps merged into a single suffocating presence. Hours blurred into each other. Mara's mind was frayed, her body numb. Every time she thought she might rest, the house reminded her it was awake. Objects moved when she wasn't looking, shadows shifted when she closed her eyes. At one point, she swore she saw a face pressed against the glass of her window, staring at her with hollow eyes that reflected no light, no emotion, only hunger. She blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. The night dragged on, unrelenting. Mara stumbled through the house, flashlight in hand whenever it worked, trying doors, looking for a safe space, finding none. The house responded to her movement, guiding her, corralling her, driving her toward the attic, where she had first seen the figure. Every instinct screamed not to go there, but she had nowhere else to run. When she finally reached the attic again, She found the room empty, yet the air felt heavier than ever. The whispers were louder, incoherent, pleading, threatening. Shadows pooled in the corners, moving as if they had life. Mara pressed herself against the wall, wishing the night would end, wishing the storm would take the house away, wishing she could disappear. And then she understood. The house was not just a structure. It was an entity, old and patient, feeding on fear, on despair, on isolation. It had watched generations of people come and go, had learned their patterns, their weaknesses. And it had chosen her. Not because she was special, but because she had walked willingly into its embrace. The first light of dawn did not come as a relief. The storm had subsided, but the house was still alive, still watching. Mara didn't leave. She couldn't. The entity had embedded itself in her mind, in her body. Every attempt to escape was futile. Every thought of fleeing was twisted into paranoia and dread. She had become part of it, a new vessel for its hunger. Neighbors later reported seeing a light flickering in the Victorian house, on and off, even after the storm had passed. Sometimes, they claimed, a figure could be seen moving behind the windows, pacing or standing still, staring outward. But no one ever entered. The house had its next victim, and the cycle continued. Mara's manuscript was never finished, but the pages left behind were filled with rambling sentences, half-formed thoughts, and an oppressive sense of watching that no one who read them could shake. The house waits for the next storm, the next lonely soul who thinks they can find peace in isolation, unaware that the storm brings more than rain. It brings hunger, and it brings shadows that live in the corners of your vision, whispers that echo your own name in voices that should not exist. And when the night grows evil and the wind howls through the trees, the house will awaken, patient and deliberate, to feed once again. Story the end. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of night where the wind carried a chill that cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. The sky was a heavy gray, almost black, and the rain that had begun as a drizzle hours earlier had thickened into a relentless downpour, drumming against the roofs and streets like some terrible percussion. Streetlights flickered intermittently, their weak yellow glow reflecting off the slick asphalt in distorted, shimmering pools. The neighborhood was unusually silent, save for the wind and rain, as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something it couldn't quite name. Marissa had taken her usual route home from the diner where she worked nights, a winding stretch of road lined with old, worn houses whose paint peeled like old scabs. Most of her coworkers had already left for the night, but she always preferred the long walk home. Even in weather like this, it gave her time to think, to shake off the residue of the diner's chaos, the clatter of plates, the shouted orders, the endless hum of the kitchen. But tonight, the walk felt different. There was a weight in the air, a suffocating heaviness that pressed against her chest with every step. She pulled her coat tighter, the hood doing little to keep the rain from soaking her hair. The street was deserted. Every house on her path had its curtains drawn, the windows dark and lifeless. A stray dog barked somewhere down the street, a sharp, solitary sound that echoed unnaturally in the emptiness. As she passed a particularly dilapidated house, she caught a movement in the corner of her eye. A figure stood just inside the shadows of the porch, impossibly still, almost blending into the darkness. Marissa's heart stuttered. It was a man, or maybe a woman, but the shape seemed wrong, too elongated, too rigid, like it wasn't quite human. She forced herself to look away and quickened her pace, telling herself it was just her imagination. The streets at night could play tricks on anyone's mind. Halfway down the block, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against her hood and running down her face in cold rivulets. The streetlights flickered again, and when they came back on, she swore she saw the figure again, closer now, standing in the middle of the road. Marissa froze. She squinted, trying to make out details through the rain, but the figure remained a silhouette, featureless, just a dark shape in the downpour. "Hey," she called out, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound confident. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Then, without warning, it turned and melted into the shadows of the side street. Marissa swallowed hard, her pulse racing, and forced herself to keep walking. She told herself it was someone just messing with her, a drunk or a prankster, but the rationalizations offered little comfort. When she reached the end of the block, her apartment building came into view, its brick facade dark and foreboding. The entrance light flickered, throwing long, jagged shadows across the steps. Marissa's relief was short-lived. The front door, which she was certain she had locked that morning, hung slightly ajar. Her keys were still in her pocket, wet and slick from the rain. She hesitated, heart pounding. Something was off, and she knew it, an instinct that had kept her safe her whole life, screaming at her to run. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The lobby was dark, the faint hum of the building's aging heating system the only sound. The smell hit her immediately, a heavy, metallic scent like blood mixed with rust. She froze, realizing with a jolt that someone had been inside. Hello? Hello? Her voice was small, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive darkness. No response. Only the sound of the rain outside, relentless, punishing. Marissa climbed the stairs two at a time, ignoring the wet, slippery steps. When she reached her floor, she found her apartment door cracked open as well, the chain lock broken. Panic clawed at her chest. She wanted to turn and run, but something rooted her to the spot, a sense that she had to see, had to know. Pushing the door gently, she stepped inside. The lights didn't work. The storm had knocked out power in the building. The only illumination came from the occasional flash of lightning outside the window, casting the room in stark, fleeting light. The apartment looked different. Not just ransacked or disturbed, but wrong. Objects were out of place, doors slightly ajar that she was certain she had closed, shadows that clung to the corners like living things. Then she saw it. On the far wall, where her mirror usually hung, was a message scrawled in what looked disturbingly like blood. I'm here. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers flew to her mouth as she stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The sound echoed in the dark room, and in that instant she felt a presence behind her. Something cold, something wrong. She spun around, heart hammering, and saw nothing. But she felt it. A weight in the air, a pressure on her chest. The temperature dropped, her breath visible in quick, ragged puffs. A whisper grazed her ear, so soft she thought she imagined it. Don't look behind you. She did. And there it was. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was the figure. Same as before, elongated, featureless, but now unmistakably human in form. Its head tilted unnaturally, jerking in a way no human neck could. It didn't move closer, didn't speak, but Marissa felt its gaze like a physical force, pressing her against the far wall. A scream caught in her throat. She backed away, tripping over her rug and hitting the floor. The figure advanced, impossibly fast, each step silent. She scrambled for the door, fumbling with her keys, her hands slick with rain and sweat. Her eyes darted to the kitchen, the living room, anywhere she could escape, but the figure blocked every path, as if the apartment itself had shifted to trap her. The lights flickered one last time. For a split second, she could see the entire room, and in that moment she realized something worse than the figure. The apartment wasn't alone. Shadows moved independently of the storm, stretching along the walls and floor like living creatures. They writhed, twisted, and in the flashes of lightning she saw faces in them, faces that were screaming, contorted in pain, twisted in silent horror. And the figure in the corner, it smiled. Not with lips, but with a dark, consuming emptiness where its face should have been. Marissa's mind went into overdrive. She needed a weapon, a plan, anything. Her eyes fell on the kitchen knife. Heart pounding, she grabbed it and stood, trembling, facing the figure. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The shadows in the room began to shift, moving toward her like a tide of darkness. Her legs screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Every door, every window seemed to dissolve into the same endless blackness. The figure tilted its head again. The whisper returned, louder this time, closer, inside her mind. You can't leave. She screamed, lunging at the figure with the knife. Her hands met empty air. The shadows surged, enveloping her, cold and suffocating. Pain, real and burning, lanced through her arms and legs, though she couldn't see what had done it. She fell to the floor, knife clattering to the ground, her vision swimming in darkness. And then, silence. For what felt like hours, she lay there, too afraid to move, too paralyzed to cry out. When she finally dared to open her eyes, the apartment was empty. The shadows were gone, the figure had vanished, and the storm outside had died down to a light drizzle. The first hints of dawn were creeping through the blinds, washing the room in a pale, weak light. Marissa got to her feet, shaking uncontrollably. Everything looked normal, or as normal as her apartment ever did, but she knew the truth. She was never alone. The presence had left, but it would return. And she would never be safe, not truly, not while the shadows waited. Weeks passed, though she counted them in restless nights and broken dreams. She avoided mirrors, avoided her apartment whenever possible, and spent long hours wandering the streets, pretending the world outside could offer some protection. But no matter where she went, the feeling followed her. The weight, the cold, the awareness that she was being watched. Then, one night, while walking home under a sickly moon, she saw it again. Just a glimpse, a shadow in a corner, a figure standing perfectly still. And this time she noticed the smile, that same impossible, faceless smile. It was waiting for her. Marissa ran, but she knew. She always knew. The figure always came back, and the shadows were patient. They would wait in corners, behind closed doors, in every darkened street, every silent room. And one night, they would catch her. She never went home again. She never stayed in one place long enough for the presence to find her. Every night was a race against it, a battle against the darkness that could bend reality, twist rooms, and warp shadows into unspeakable forms. Friends tried to help, but no one believed her. No one understood. The police were called once. After she left her apartment, a panicked frenzy claiming someone or something was in there, but the officers found nothing, not a single sign of intrusion, nothing. Marissa learned to live in the edges of society, sleeping in cheap motels, on benches, in abandoned buildings, anywhere she could hide from the darkness. But it never stopped. It never relented. Every rainy night, every flickering streetlight, every shadow stretching longer than it should, it was watching, waiting, smiling. And deep down, she knew the truth she could never admit, even to herself. It wasn't just watching, it was learning, growing. It would adapt. One day it would be inside her room again, and there would be no escape, no running, no hiding. She was marked, and the night was eternal. Even now, sitting in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, sipping lukewarm coffee, she feels it. The weight on her shoulders, the cold that no jacket can dispel. The whisper in the back of her mind, soft but insistent, I'm here. Marissa doesn't look over her shoulder. She doesn't need to. She knows. The darkness is patient, eternal, and inevitable. And tonight, like every other night, she will run again because there is no other choice. Story the end. The rain had started early that evening, soft at first, a drizzle that blurred the edges of the streetlights and made the asphalt glisten like wet glass. By the time Mark drove home from his late shift at the diner, the drizzle had turned into a steady, relentless downpour. The highway was nearly deserted, the occasional car splashing past in a blur of headlights, leaving behind a wake of spray and fleeting shadows. He had taken this route countless times, a shortcut through the outskirts of town that cut through a stretch of woods. Normally, it was quiet, almost peaceful, but tonight, with the wind howling through the trees and the sky a dark, bruised purple, it felt oppressive. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel, noticing how the rain hammered against the windshield, blurring the world beyond. The wipers struggled to keep up, flicking back and forth with a mechanical insistence. He squinted through the haze, catching glimpses of the trees leaning inward, their branches writhing as if alive, reaching for him. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped, the sound sharp and sudden, echoing across the empty road. He shivered despite the heater blowing warm air into the car. It was then that he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, barely visible through the sheets of rain. A woman, drenched, with dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked and clinging to her frame. She looked wrong somehow. Not just wet, not just cold, but unnatural. Her stance was rigid, almost puppet-like, and she didn't move when the headlights swept over her. Mark's first instinct was to slow down, to pull over and make sure she was okay. But something in the way she held herself, motionless, staring, made his stomach knot with fear. As he slowed, the wipers casting jagged streaks of light, she suddenly turned her head, and he saw her eyes, wide, impossibly dark, unblinking. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the wheel. For a second, he thought about just driving past, pretending he hadn't seen her, but something, curiosity or a misplaced sense of responsibility, made him stop. The car shuddered to a halt a few feet from her. Rain poured through the open window, soaking his shirt instantly when he cracked it. "Hey," he called, voice wavering. "Are you okay?" No answer. He got out, slipping on the wet asphalt as he approached. The closer he got, the more he noticed that she was shivering violently, though there was no wind hitting her face. Her lips moved, whispering something, but the sound was drowned by the rain. He leaned closer, trying to hear, but before he could, she tilted her head in a way that made his stomach drop. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her arm and pointed. "Inside," she whispered, her voice wet, low, and almost hollow. Mark's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. The woods were thick behind her, dark and foreboding, but there was a faint light flickering through the trees ahead, barely visible in the rain. Something about the way she looked, the way she moved, or didn't move, made him obey. He had no idea why, but he found himself following her through the mud, past gnarled trees and puddles that swallowed his boots. The light grew brighter until he reached a clearing. A small cabin sat there, its windows glowing faintly with yellow light. Smoke spiraled from a crooked chimney, curling into the stormy sky. The woman stopped at the edge of the clearing, pointing again at the door. Mark approached cautiously, his hand brushing the wet wood of the door. "Hello?" he called out, but the cabin answered only with the low creak of its frame settling in the wind. He glanced back at her. She was still standing there, motionless, like a figure carved from shadows. Something about the place felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and the smell of damp wood and something rotting made him gag. Yet, he couldn't leave. He reached for the doorknob, and as soon as his fingers touched it, the door swung open on its own with a soft creak. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the light from a single lamp flickering. The air was colder than outside, unnatural and sharp against his skin. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The sound made him jump. The cabin was empty, or at least, it appeared empty. The walls were lined with old photographs, faces blurred and eyes scratched out, and in the center of the floor was a single chair, facing away from him. On the chair, something stirred. Mark froze. The chair slowly rotated, and there she was again, sitting upright, even though the chair had been empty before. The woman, her eyes glimmered in the low light, wide and black, and her lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. I I saw you outside," Mark stammered, stepping back. "I thought you needed help." She tilted her head, studying him. "Help? No one helps here." The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, moving subtly as if alive. The lamp flickered violently, and Mark's stomach dropped as he realized the shadows weren't just in the corners. They were creeping along the walls, stretching toward him. I I think I should go," he whispered, backing toward the door. She stood, moving silently, impossibly fast, and blocked his path. The air grew colder, and Mark could see his breath in jagged clouds. "You can't leave," she said. "Not now." Panic surged through him. He ducked under her arm, sprinting toward the door, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, dark and wet, pulsating faintly as if alive. He screamed, pounding on it, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the cabin. Behind him, the shadows began to move more aggressively, crawling along the floor like tendrils. He could feel them brushing his legs, cold and sticky, trying to pull him down. He stumbled, falling to his knees, heart racing, gasping for air. The woman's smile widened. "You shouldn't have followed me." Mark scrambled backward, tripping over something on the floor. He looked down and saw dozens of photographs scattered in a circle around him, all of them faces scratched out, eyes hollow. He noticed one photograph in particular. It was his own face, the eyes slashed open, a smile carved onto his features. His chest heaved as he realized the woman had been waiting for him. The shadows surged, wrapping around his arms and legs, holding him in place. He tried to scream, but his voice failed him. The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a dark hunger. "It's your turn," she whispered. Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt. The walls stretched and bent, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. Mark was lifted off his feet, suspended in a void of rain and shadows. He could feel the life being drained from him, the warmth leaving his body. The photographs on the floor began to rise, floating around him, eyes blinking, mouths whispering his name. "Please, no," he begged, but the voice that came back wasn't his own. It was hollow, like wind through a grave. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him completely was the woman's smile, wider than humanly possible, stretching across her face, her eyes burning with a cold, eternal hunger. When the storm finally passed over that stretch of highway, the clearing was empty. The cabin had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but mud, broken branches, and the faint imprint of wet footprints leading into the woods. Locals who drove past the road in the days that followed reported seeing a lone figure standing at the edge of the trees whenever it rained, dark, silent, watching. Some swore it was a woman, others said it was a shadow, but everyone who saw her knew the same thing. She never blinked, and she never left. Mark was never found. His car was abandoned a few miles down the road, tires spinning in shallow puddles. The diner where he worked kept a candle burning on his empty stool for weeks, a silent hope for someone who had vanished without a sound. People whispered that he had wandered into the storm, chasing something he shouldn't have seen, and now belonged to the woods. And on nights like that, when the rain falls hard and the wind shrieks through the trees, some say you can hear him calling out from the shadows, just beyond the headlights, trapped in the same cabin that has no doors, no walls, only the endless dark and the woman who waits. No one who drives that stretch of road at night stops anymore. Those who do say they see her at the edge of the road, and if they look too long into her eyes, they vanish, leaving behind only the sound of rain and a whisper, "It's your turn." Story the end. It had been raining all day in the small town of Ashwood, the kind of steady, drumming rain that seeps into your bones and makes every shadow feel alive. By evening, the streets were slick and shiny, reflecting the dim orange glow of streetlights, and the fog that had rolled in from the nearby woods made everything seem distant, distorted. Most people had stayed indoors, the town settling into an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than ordinary silence. Marcus had been driving all day, running late on deliveries for the family-run moving company he worked for. The last job had kept him stuck in the outskirts of town, winding down roads he didn't recognize, the GPS flickering with weak signals as if warning him not to go further. By the time he finished unloading the final boxes at a small vacant rental house, the sun had completely disappeared, leaving the sky a flat, oppressive gray. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Nearly 10 p.m. That wasn't late by any means, but the emptiness around him made it feel dangerous. He started the truck and tried to follow the GPS back to the main road. The rain made the asphalt slick, and the fog limited his visibility to just a few feet in front of him. As he turned a sharp corner, something moved across the road. Something thin, tall, but human-shaped. He slammed on the brakes, skidding a little before the truck stopped. He blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed up by the fog. His pulse quickened, and he muttered to himself, "Just a person. Probably walking." He eased back onto the road, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Minutes passed, and the sense of being watched didn't let up. The fog seemed to press against the windshield, thickening unnaturally, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the trees lining the road were shifting, leaning just enough to block the headlights. Then he saw it. A house, tucked back from the road, older than anything else he'd seen, with a single dim light flickering in the upstairs window. It shouldn't have been there. There were no other houses for at least a mile. He slowed down instinctively, curious but cautious. The house had peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a front porch that looked like it had almost collapsed. Something about it felt wrong, though he couldn't put a finger on why. The light upstairs flickered again, almost like it was blinking at him. Marcus shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It had to be someone's old lamp, or maybe even a candle. But the way it moved, it wasn't random. The next thing he knew, his truck sputtered and died. He tried to start it again, but the engine refused to turn over. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone. No signal. He cursed under his breath and leaned back against the seat, staring at the house. The fog swirled closer, the yellow porch light becoming clearer. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to leave, but something compelled him forward, as if the house itself was pulling him in. He stepped out of the truck. The rain was heavier now, soaking through his jacket in seconds. Each step toward the house seemed longer than the last, as if the ground itself resisted him. He reached the porch and noticed the front door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. No one else should have been around at this hour. Hello? His voice barely carried in the rain. No answer. He nudged the door gently, and it creaked open, revealing a dark hallway lined with old, yellowed wallpaper that curled at the edges. The air smelled of mildew and decay. The faint light upstairs cast long, strange shadows that seemed to stretch and twitch in impossible ways. He called out again, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice trembled this time, though he tried to hide it. Silence answered. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning under his weight. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched endlessly, more rooms than seemed possible. The flickering light came from the end of the corridor, from a door slightly ajar. Marcus approached it cautiously. As he got closer, he saw a figure, a man, sitting in a chair facing away from him, but the posture was wrong. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, almost as if it had been broken. The slow, rhythmic rocking of the chair made Marcus's stomach churn. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. The figure didn't respond. Then it turned. The face was pale, stretched unnaturally wide, and the eyes, oh, the eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck the light from the hallway. Marcus froze. The mouth opened in a silent scream, and the rocking stopped abruptly. For a moment, the house was dead silent, as if holding its breath. Then a sound, soft scratching, echoed from the other rooms, growing louder, surrounding him. Shadows moved along the walls, impossible shapes twisting and writhing. He stumbled back, his hand hitting the railing, sending it wobbling. And then the figure spoke. Not with words, but a sound. Low, guttural, like a voice underwater. Marcus couldn't understand it, couldn't even register it as language. Fear rooted him to the spot. Something shifted behind him. He turned to see the hallway extending infinitely. Doors opening into darkness that had no bottom, no walls, just endless black. The shadows spilled out, creeping toward him. Marcus ran. He ran blindly down the stairs, slipping in the rain, but the house seemed endless. The porch never came closer. The truck never came into view. Every time he thought he had reached the outside, the door would lead him back inside, into another hallway, another room, always darker than before. He heard whispers then, faint, almost imperceptible, but growing louder. They spoke in unison, voices overlapping, calling his name. Marcus? Marcus? They came from everywhere, behind the walls, beneath the floor, through the ceiling. Panic set in. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. His legs moved on their own, climbing stairs, descending stairs, running through rooms that shouldn't exist. And all the while, the figure, the pale man, followed him, always just out of reach, head tilted, rocking chair swaying, even though no chair was beneath him. Time lost meaning. Hours? Minutes? Seconds? He couldn't tell. The rain outside turned into a torrential downpour, then stopped, then started again, each change synchronized with the flickering of the upstairs light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Finally, Marcus stumbled into a room that smelled different, sickly sweet like decaying flowers. In the center was a mirror, full length, cracked in places. He froze. The reflection wasn't his own. It was the figure, pale, hollow-eyed, mouth open in that eternal scream. And behind it the hallway stretched endlessly, walls lined with hundreds of faces, all twisted in silent terror, all reaching out, pressing against the glass as if they wanted to escape. A cold hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around. No one was there. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. In its place, his own face stared back, pale, wet with rain or sweat, wide-eyed with fear. But something was wrong. His eyes weren't hollow, yet. They seemed heavier, darker, like something inside him was being pulled out, replaced. The whispers became a roar. Marcus tried to run, but the room shifted, floor turning into liquid, ceiling stretching endlessly. He fell, sinking, and the mirror's surface rippled like water. Faces pressed from the other side, mouths moving, screaming silently. He screamed, finally, a raw, ragged sound, but it was swallowed instantly. Then darkness. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was in his truck, rain dripping from his hair, the engine finally running. The street was empty, the fog receding as if nothing had happened. But in the rearview mirror, for the briefest second, he saw it, pale, hollow-eyed, rocking in a chair that should not exist, staring at him from the back seat. He floored the gas, racing down the slick roads toward Ashwood, but the feeling never left him. Every shadow in every passing streetlight seemed to twitch. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the hallway, the mirrors, the faces pressed against the glass. By the time he reached his small apartment on the edge of town, he was shaking uncontrollably. He locked every door and window, checked the bolts 3 times, but the unease didn't lift. He slept fitfully, dreams filled with dark hallways, whispering faces, and that same flickering light. The next morning, he tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare, brought on by the rain, the exhaustion, the isolation of the outskirts. But when he reached into his jacket pocket for his phone, he froze. There, carved into the leather, were scratches forming letters. "Marcus, come back!" He tore the jacket from his body, flinging it across the room. Nothing else seemed amiss, but the air felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on him, waiting. He tried to leave, tried to drive to work, but every familiar street became unfamiliar, twisting, impossible. Even the sun seemed dimmer, as if struggling against the gloom that followed him wherever he went. Days passed, but Marcus couldn't shake it. At night, he swore he could hear the rocking chair, faint, behind the walls of his apartment. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, dissolving whenever he turned his head. And always the whispering growing louder every night, repeating his name, promising that the house was waiting. One evening, he found himself walking without remembering how he got there, drawn down a side street at the edge of town. And there it was again, the house, waiting in the fog, light flickering in the same upstairs window. It didn't matter that the town had no such street. It didn't matter that he had just come from home. Something else was guiding him, pulling him toward it, and the whispers were no longer distant. They were inside his head, filling his thoughts, echoing with every heartbeat. "Marcus, Marcus, come back!" He tried to run, tried to resist, but the fog closed in, and the rain fell harder, pounding against his skull. The light upstairs winked at him, a signal, an invitation he knew he could not deny. His feet carried him forward, each step heavier than the last, but unstoppable. By the time he reached the porch, he knew the truth. The house was alive. It had been waiting for him, just as it had for countless others before. The door swung open on its own, and the hallway stretched endlessly, shadows writhing along the walls. The rocking chair swayed in the dim light upstairs, as though acknowledging his arrival. Marcus stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a deafening finality. Outside, the town remained silent, the fog slowly receding, leaving no trace of the house but the memory of its light. And somewhere in that oppressive gloom, the whispers continued, waiting for the next weary traveler drawn into the darkness. Story the end. It was a night unlike any other. The wind howled through the trees lining the narrow back roads of northern Pennsylvania, whipping loose branches against the sides of houses as if warning them of some unseen threat. Clouds swallowed the moon whole, casting the world into a gray, suffocating darkness, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the wet asphalt for a split second, exposing the twisted, skeletal silhouettes of the woods that pressed in from both sides. The air was thick with the scent of rain and decay, the kind of smell that crawls under your skin when you walk alone long enough to start imagining things moving just beyond your sight. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. She had driven these roads countless times on her way home from late shifts at the diner, but tonight the streets felt alien, as if some malevolent force had rearranged them while she wasn't looking. Her small sedan bounced over a patch of broken asphalt, and she winced at the sudden jolt. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but each droplet that hit the windshield sounded like a whisper, a distant hiss she couldn't quite identify. Her phone vibrated, a buzzing that seemed unusually loud against the oppressive silence of the night. She glanced at the screen. No signal. Again. It was a common problem out this far from town, but tonight it felt more threatening, more isolating. The light from the screen reflected briefly in the rear view mirror, and she thought she saw something there. An indistinct shape hunched in the back seat, vanishing the moment she blinked. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, though her voice sounded small and fragile, swallowed by the hum of the tires over wet asphalt. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, a hammering rhythm that seemed louder than the engine, louder than the wind. The road forked. She swore she hadn't seen this fork before, at least not like this. A jagged wooden sign pointed left, the paint peeling, almost illegible in the darkness. Right led toward the town, she thought, and instinctively she veered that way. But the moment her tires touched the wet gravel of the right path, she felt it, a heavy, almost tangible weight pressing against her chest, like the night itself was watching, waiting. A low, drawn-out groan echoed through the trees, followed by a snap of a branch close to the car. Sarah's breath caught. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely above the patter of rain. No answer. Only the groaning wind and that persistent feeling that something was moving just outside, circling, waiting. She sped up, trying to shake the sensation, but the car seemed sluggish, as if some unseen hand was dragging it back. Her headlights caught something up ahead, a figure, thin and ragged, standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching, but the figure didn't move. It was human-shaped, hunched slightly, the edges of its clothes hanging in wet tatters, its face obscured by shadow. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She rolled down the window a crack, hoping for something, anything, that would make sense. "Are you okay?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The figure remained still, almost blending into the darkness, like it was part of the night itself. The rain intensified suddenly, hammering the windshield. Sarah wiped it frantically, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. Not just off to the side, it had vanished entirely. She blinked, but the road ahead was empty, only slick asphalt and the reflection of lightning in the puddles. She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself it was her imagination, the combination of exhaustion and stormy night playing tricks on her. She reached for the radio, hoping for the comforting static or a song she knew, but all she got was silence. Dead. No stations, no interference, just the oppressive quiet that made every rustle in the trees sound like footsteps. Her phone vibrated again. She jumped, snatched it up, and this time there was a message. No contact, just text. Turn back. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely grip the wheel. She laughed again, but it sounded hollow. Some kid must have the same cell tower glitch, sending random spam texts. She tried calling her friend Mike, someone she trusted, but the call didn't connect. Every signal bar on her phone blinked empty, leaving her stranded in the darkness. The road twisted sharply, and her headlights caught something else. A house. Old, abandoned, the windows dark and unbroken. It wasn't listed on any map she had seen, and from the looks of it, no one had lived there in decades. But the moment she saw it, she felt compelled, like some magnet inside her chest was pulling her forward. Against every instinct screaming at her to drive past, she turned to the driveway. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and as she approached, she saw that the front door was slightly ajar. Not blown open, not forced, just ajar, inviting. The kind of invitation that's a warning in itself. She parked and sat there, heart hammering. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent. Blood? Maybe just rust. Maybe decay. Her curiosity, mingled with that strange pull, got the better of her. She stepped out, pulling the coat tighter against the cold, damp air, and approached the door. Inside, the air was different, thicker, colder, almost viscous. The wood creaked beneath her feet, and the shadows seemed to ripple along the walls. Every instinct told her to leave, but something in the back of her mind, the part that felt like it had been nudged by the text message, urged her forward. The hallway stretched impossibly long, though the house didn't look that large from the outside. Each step echoed, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. She turned into a living room, the furniture shrouded in white sheets, ghost-like in the flashes of lightning through the boarded-up windows. And then she saw it. The staircase, leading upward, darker than the rest of the house. A low whispering reached her ears. She couldn't make out the words, but it was human, almost pleading. She froze, listening. Then it came again, clearer. "Don't look back." Her pulse spiked. She wanted to run, wanted to bolt out the door and into the storm, but her legs felt rooted, as if invisible hands pressed into her calves, stopping her. Something cold brushed against her shoulder. She spun, but nothing was there. The whispering had turned into laughter, soft, cruel, echoing from the staircase. She realized she had been drawn here for a reason, though she couldn't comprehend it. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, and when she flicked it on, the beam illuminated something that made her stomach drop. Scratches on the walls, words carved deep, the letters jagged and raw. "Leave now or join us." A door at the top of the stairs slammed shut violently, and Sarah's scream caught in her throat. Something moved at the top, a shape hunched, jerking unnaturally, its limbs twisted. Lightning struck, illuminating a face that shouldn't exist, pale, elongated, eyes black pits, mouth stretched impossibly wide, teeth glinting. Sarah stumbled back, tripping over a loose floorboard. The house seemed to breathe around her, the walls contracting and expanding like ribs. The laughter multiplied, coming from every corner, from the ceiling, from beneath the floor. She tried the front door. It was gone, replaced by a wall, slick and black, pulsing. She ran to a window, desperate, but the glass wasn't glass anymore. It was a liquid, and she could see something moving beneath the surface, shadowy forms that wriggled and hissed. She clawed at the frame, screaming, but it gave way like water swallowing her hand. Something cold and wet wrapped around her ankle, yanking her toward the floor. She fell, hitting her head. The world tilted, shadows crawling over her vision. A voice deep and guttural whispered from everywhere and nowhere, "You can't leave, you belong here." Sarah fought, pulling with every ounce of strength, but the darkness was infinite. The laughter, the whispers, the scratching, everything pressed in until it was all she could sense, and then she felt a hand on her shoulder, human, warm, soft. Relief flooded her senses. She turned, but no one was there. The hand remained cold now, firm, pulling her down into the floor, into a dark pit that opened beneath the house. Her last thought before the darkness consumed her completely. Maybe the warning was true. Maybe this night was alive, waiting, feeding, and now she would be part of it. Another whisper in the wind, another shape in the storm, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to drive down these cursed roads. Outside, the storm continued. The trees groaned and the rain pelted the asphalt. The road ahead stretched endlessly, slick and reflective, as if the night itself had eyes and was watching, judging, waiting. And in the distance, faint, almost imperceptible, a car horn honked, but no one was behind the wheel. The town would never know what happened. Search parties would come days later, calling her name, walking the roads in the drizzle, hearing the wind but finding nothing. And on nights like this, when the clouds swallowed the moon and the storm raged through the woods, she would be out there, part of the darkness, waiting for the next traveler, the next curious soul who thought they could navigate a gloomy, evil night. The storm moved on, leaving silence in its wake, but the forest held its breath. Every branch, every leaf, every whispering shadow waited for the inevitable return of the road's next victim. And in the emptiness, the house, standing still in the woods, exhaled. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the wind seemed to crawl through the streets like it had a mind of its own, rattling shutters and twisting the skeletal branches of the trees into grotesque shapes. The kind of night where the clouds were so thick that the moon and stars didn't bother trying to show themselves, leaving the town bathed in a dim, muted gray. A persistent drizzle coated the roads and sidewalks, turning them slick and reflective, the sound of water dripping from gutters filling the otherwise suffocating silence. In a small town somewhere in the Midwest, a town of aging houses and shuttered storefronts, the kind of town people moved away from but never really forgot, a storm like this had begun to take hold, and with it, an unease that settled deep in the bones. Evan Harper had only moved into town a few weeks prior, taking a job as an electrician for the local power company. He liked the quiet, the way the air smelled like wet asphalt and wood smoke in the early evenings. He was used to long hours alone on checking circuits and repairing lines, but tonight the solitude felt oppressive in a way he couldn't shake. The storm was still hours away when he had arrived at the old house on the edge of town to repair the wiring for the owner, a Mrs. Carlyle, an elderly woman who had lived in the house for decades. From the moment he stepped inside, he had felt it. The house didn't just creak and groan like old houses did. It seemed to breathe, to respond to his presence in ways that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The living room was dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. Water dripped from the ceiling in the corners, forming small puddles on the floorboards that had long ago surrendered to rot. As Evan moved through the house, toolbox in hand, he noticed details that were out of place. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift when he glanced at them from the corner of his eye. Shadows pooled in the corners thicker than the absence of light should allow. He shook his head, blaming the exhaustion of long hours and the oppressive weather outside. Mrs. Carlyle appeared then, shuffling toward him with a lantern, the light from the flame casting jagged shadows across her face. Her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and calculating. "The storm's coming," she said in a voice that was soft but commanding. "You should be careful tonight. The house, it doesn't like visitors after dark." Evan laughed nervously. "I've been in worse storms, ma'am. I'll be fine." But as he began inspecting the wiring in the hallway, he felt a sudden drop in temperature, a cold that seemed to seep into his bones and make his teeth chatter. The storm had not yet begun, but there was a wind in the house now, a gust that came from nowhere, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic, coppery, almost like blood. He shook his head, telling himself he was imagining things. Old houses settle, wind finds its way through cracks, drafts are normal. He moved to the basement, where the main breaker box was located. The steps creaked under his weight, each one sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he reached the bottom, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from his girlfriend. "Don't stay out too late. The storm sounds bad." He smiled faintly and texted back a reassurance, but as he did, he noticed something odd about the basement walls. The plaster seemed to writhe under the dim light of his phone, subtle movements like veins pulsing beneath the surface. He rubbed his eyes, certain that exhaustion was making him see things. Yet the sensation of being watched, of being observed, pressed against his mind more forcefully with each passing second. Evan knelt before the breaker box, tools in hand, but the air shifted. A low hum began, resonant and vibrating, emanating from the very walls themselves. He froze, listening. The hum grew louder, harmonizing with the creaks and groans of the house, until it became a chorus of sound indistinguishable from words. He couldn't make out the language, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, cold, threatening. Panic surged, and he fumbled with the breakers, trying to restore the power, trying to silence the noise, but nothing worked. Then he saw it. A figure, fleeting and indistinct, flickering in the corner of the basement. Not fully formed, as if the darkness itself had shaped it into something vaguely human. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, and each motion seemed synchronized with the vibrations in the walls. Evan's heart pounded, and his instincts screamed at him to flee. He bolted up the stairs, barely managing to keep his footing as the steps seemed to stretch and contract beneath him. The storm arrived shortly after midnight. Rain pelted the roof in heavy, relentless sheets. Thunder shook the ground, and lightning cast violent, staccato bursts of light through the house. Evan could hear the wind howling, carrying with it sounds that didn't belong. A scratching, faint and deliberate, coming from the windows, the walls, from everywhere and nowhere at once. He tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. He slammed against it, again and again, until his knuckles were raw, but it held firm. He retreated to the living room, where Mrs. Carlyle's lanterns flickered weakly. Shadows writhed on the walls, and from the corners whispers began. Low, insidious voices that spoke directly into his mind. Names, dates, secrets, the sort of intimate details that no stranger should know. He clutched his head, screaming, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. The figure returned, now more distinct, hovering near the ceiling, eyes black voids reflecting the lightning flashes. It spoke in the same voice that echoed in his mind, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't be here. You don't belong." Evan tried to speak, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. Fear consumed him, paralyzing every muscle. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had become meaningless, distorted by the storm and the oppressive presence in the house. Evan stumbled from room to room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The walls themselves seemed to shift, corridors elongating, doors leading to places that defied logic. In the kitchen, he found traces of something smeared along the floor and walls. At first, he thought it was mud from the storm, but it glistened wetly under the lantern's flame, dark and sticky, smelling faintly of iron. Blood. He gagged, turning away, but the substance spread as he moved, creeping like a living thing, following him. By the early morning, when the storm finally began to subside, Evan was trapped in the attic. The roof above him leaked. The floor beneath him groaned under unseen weight. The figure stood at the far end, motionless, waiting. Evan's strength was gone. He had not eaten or drunk for hours. He sank to the floor, exhausted, unable to move. The whispers had become a constant drone, repeating the same phrases over and over. You cannot leave. You are ours now. You belong. And then, just as the first weak rays of dawn attempted to pierce the storm clouds, the figure moved. Not quickly, not violently, but with a purpose so deliberate it made Evan's heart seize. It approached, its face coming into view for the first time. Not a face, exactly, but a hollow void where features should have been, black as the space between stars, yet somehow full of malice. Evan screamed, but it was swallowed instantly by the darkness. The last thing he saw before consciousness failed him was the figure reaching out, stretching impossibly long arms toward him, enveloping him in shadows that tasted like the end of everything. The neighbors reported strange noises during the night, screams, the sound of furniture moving, whispers, but no one dared investigate. When the power was restored, the house appeared perfectly normal, as if nothing had occurred. Yet when Mrs. Carlyle was asked about Evan the next morning, she only shook her head. He was never supposed to come, she said softly, eyes distant. Some storms bring more than rain. Evan Harper was never seen again. The house on the edge of town remained, its windows dark, its doors locked tight, and the locals whispered about it only in hushed tones. Some claimed that on stormy nights you could hear screams inside or see shadows moving behind the windows, shapes that didn't belong to any living being. Others said it was the wind, or the trees, or the way old houses groan. But those who had ventured close enough, drawn by curiosity or skepticism, swore they felt a presence that watched and waited, patient and endless, for those foolish enough to enter during the storm. And the town, as it always does, went on. Streets emptied by midnight, the streets gleamed wet and reflective under the gray sky. The storm returned, year after year, each one carrying the same warning in its howling winds and clattering rain. There are things in the dark, things older than any living soul, that wait for the right night, the right storm, to claim what they desire. The house remained, impervious to the passage of time, a wound in the earth that refused to heal, holding something just beyond the veil of the visible, something that remembered Evan Harper and anyone else foolish enough to wander into its shadow. Those who lived near the house learned to avoid the stormy nights, to shutter windows and lock doors, and even then, sometimes in the darkest hours, they heard it. A low hum, a whispering name, a movement in the corner of their vision that vanished the instant they turned their head. And sometimes, if they were brave or foolish, they would see it, a tall, thin shape, with eyes like empty voids, grinning in the darkness, patient, waiting, as though it had always been there and would always remain, feeding on fear and shadows, unbound by reason or mercy. And on nights when the wind was particularly cold and the rain fell in heavy sheets, if someone stopped long enough to listen, they could hear the whispers, not from the storm, not from the trees, but from the dark itself, speaking directly into the mind, telling each passerby the same thing it had told Evan Harper: you don't belong here. You never did. And soon, neither will you. Story the end. It was a night, the kind of darkness that seemed to seep into the bones, the kind that made even the familiar streets of suburban America feel alien. Rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering against rooftops and windshield wipers, and the wind moaned through the bare branches of trees like something alive. The power had gone out hours earlier, leaving the town of Millfield shrouded in blackness, its streets silent except for the occasional groan of a mailbox bending under the storm and the patter of water down empty gutters. The streetlights flickered and died one by one, leaving only pools of shadow where light should have been. Jason had been driving home from an overnight shift at the factory, the roads slick with rain, headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. He hated nights like this. Nights where the weather was more alive than people, where the ordinary seemed sinister. He hated driving alone, but it was unavoidable. He didn't want to stay at the plant any longer than necessary. Every shadow pressed close to the edges of his vision as he drove, shapes in the darkness that seemed to move just when he looked away. By the time he turned onto Hawthorne Lane, a narrow, winding street that led to the outskirts of town, he had the sense that the night was watching him, waiting. The houses along the lane were old, the kind built decades ago, with creaking porches and shuttered windows. Some had been abandoned for years, their yards overgrown, their paint peeling in long strips. One house in particular caught his eye, the Peterson place. It had been empty since the family had disappeared without explanation almost 5 years ago. Local rumor held that the house was cursed, that people who went near it at night could feel eyes on them even if no one was there. Jason told himself he was imagining things, that it was just the storm and his exhaustion talking, but as he drove past, he swore he saw a shadow move behind the window on the second floor. He blinked. Nothing. But the feeling stayed, a gnawing sensation that made the hairs on his neck rise. He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tighter, and turned onto Maple Drive, a shortcut to his apartment. The rain was heavier here, blurring the world into gray streaks. He tried to focus on the road, but his headlights caught something strange in the middle of the street. A figure, standing perfectly still, drenched, indistinct. His heart thudded, and he slammed on the brakes. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt. When he looked again, the figure was gone, vanished as though it had never been there. His stomach churned, and for a moment he considered turning around, but something, dread perhaps, or curiosity, made him drive on. The street narrowed even further, overhanging trees forming tunnels of shadow. Each shadow seemed deeper, darker, more tangible than the last. Jason could feel his pulse in his ears, the rhythmic thump growing louder as his mind whispered warnings he didn't want to hear. That's when he saw it again, a figure, this time closer, standing at the edge of the road, wet hair plastered to its face, clothes clinging to a pale, indistinct shape. It tilted its head slightly, and though he couldn't see the eyes, he knew they were fixed on him. A shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively pressed the accelerator, the truck sliding slightly on the wet road. He didn't look back. By the time he reached his apartment complex, he felt like the night itself had followed him, closing in with every mile. The lights in the building were out too, the lobby dark except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the wet marble floors. He fumbled for his keys, his fingers trembling, and finally got inside. The door locked with a loud click behind him, but the sense of being watched didn't dissipate. It lingered, heavy and suffocating. His apartment was small, but he preferred it that way. Less space, fewer hiding places. He flipped on a flashlight, walking through each room to reassure himself. Everything was in place, nothing out of order. And yet, when he stood in the living room, he felt it, the same pressure, the sensation of eyes on him, just beyond the reach of light. He tried to laugh it off, muttering about the storm and exhaustion, but the sound died in his throat. The air itself felt thicker, heavier, as if the storm had carried something inside with it. He made himself a cup of coffee, pacing the tiny kitchen, trying to listen to the normal sounds of the night, the rain, the distant rumble of thunder. But there was something else, faint, almost imperceptible. A scratching sound at the window. He froze. The rain obscured the glass, but the scratching continued, soft and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. Heart hammering, he approached the window and peered out. Nothing, only the storm, only the darkness. He opened the blinds carefully. Still nothing. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet thump against the wall behind him. He spun around. The flashlight illuminated nothing, only the familiar furniture, the unassuming walls. But the sense of presence had grown, tangible now, almost pressing against his skin. He backed toward the door, thinking of calling the police, but the phone lines were dead. The storm had knocked them out. Panic surged, a living thing in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. That's when the whisper came. Just a soft sound, wet, guttural, almost beneath hearing, coming from the hallway outside his bedroom. He strained to listen. It said a single word over and over, slow and deliberate. Jason. His name, drawn out, distorted. The hair on his arm stood on end. He could feel the air vibrating with it, a pressure that made his ears ring. And then another sound, closer this time, the shuffle of wet feet on the carpet, moving toward him. Jason grabbed a chair, raising it like a weapon, and edged backward toward the bedroom. The light from the flashlight flickered, weak, and he could see the shadows in the corners of the room stretching unnaturally, reaching toward him. The whisper became a hiss, urgent and cruel. Come! It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A figure emerged from the darkness, pale, soaked, its features impossible to distinguish, but human enough to terrify him. Its movements were slow, deliberate, predatory. He swung the chair, but it passed through air, hitting nothing. The figure advanced, silent but unmistakable in its intent. Jason turned, ran for the door, and tried the handle. Locked. He pounded, screaming, but the sound of his own voice seemed swallowed by the night, by the storm, by the presence that had invaded his home. The figure stopped just inside the room, and in a moment that felt like hours, raised a hand, pointing directly at him. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a voice that was almost human, almost familiar. "You can't leave." Jason backed into the corner, terror paralyzing him. The figure tilted its head, and he caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. The skin was pale, wet, stretched, and the eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, as if they were made to consume light. They fixed on him, and Jason felt a wave of nausea, vertigo, as if the darkness itself was reaching into him, pulling, twisting. He screamed, a sound full of raw human fear, but it didn't matter. The figure stepped forward, closer, and the shadows seemed to breathe with it, curling around the walls, creeping along the ceiling. In a desperate act, Jason lunged past it, slamming his shoulder against the door. The handle finally gave way, and he bolted down the hallway, flashlight swinging wildly. He could hear the figure behind him, moving impossibly fast now, whispers and wet shuffles echoing in the storm. He burst into the stairwell, ran down to the lobby, and out into the rain. The storm hit him like a wall of water, but he didn't care. He ran across the slick pavement, past empty cars, past the darkened houses, never looking back. When he finally reached his truck, the seat was wet, the door damp from rain, but it didn't matter. He fumbled with the keys, shaking violently, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rain and shadows. He drove without direction, the town blurring past him, streets twisting unnaturally, familiar landmarks seeming wrong. Every so often he caught movement in the periphery, a shadow by a tree, a figure in a window, fleeting, impossible to confirm. The feeling of being hunted never left. By morning, the storm had subsided, leaving streets littered with debris, leaves, broken branches. Jason found himself at a diner on the edge of town, soaked, exhausted, unable to comprehend what had happened. He didn't speak at first, he just sat with a cup of coffee, trembling. When he finally told the waitress what he had seen, she nodded as though it were something she had expected. "The storm brings them out," she said softly. "It's worse when it's dark, when no one's around. You weren't the first. You won't be the last." Jason never returned to Millfield. He moved to another state, got a new job, a new life. But the nights never stopped. In every storm, in every shadowed corner, in every flicker of light, he saw it again. The pale figure, the impossible eyes, the whisper of his name carried on the wind. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake to find a shadow in his bedroom, just at the edge of vision, staring. And always, always, the voice, "You can't leave." The experience followed him like a scar, unseen but ever present. The storm had opened a door, and something had come through. Something patient, something eternal. And Jason knew, deep down, that no matter how far he ran, no matter where he hid, it was still out there, waiting, whispering, hungry. Story the end. It started with the rain. Not the gentle, pattering kind that brings comfort or nostalgia, but the kind that makes the air heavy, thick, with the smell of wet asphalt and rotting leaves. The wind had been screaming all evening, rattling window frames and bending trees so far that Daniel thought they might snap. He sat alone in his small apartment on the edge of town, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the room, shadows flickering along the walls. Outside, the streetlights struggled against the darkness, their beams weak, flickering, as if even they were afraid of the night. Daniel had moved to Ashfield only a few months ago, drawn to the town by cheap rent and the promise of quiet. He'd gotten used to the constant fog that rolled in from the hills, the smell of damp earth that clung to the air no matter the season. But tonight, there was something different. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the walls, making the room feel smaller. He couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched, that there was something beyond the shadows that wasn't entirely human. Around 9, he decided to go out for a walk, thinking the movement might clear his mind. He grabbed his jacket and stepped into the rain, the cold droplets soaking through his clothes in seconds. The streets were deserted. Streetlights flickered intermittently, illuminating puddles that reflected broken images of the world above. Every so often, the wind carried a strange, low hum, almost like voices whispering through the trees. But when Daniel strained to listen, the sound vanished. He told himself it was just the storm, just the wind, playing tricks. As he walked past the old Winthrop estate on the hill, Daniel noticed something strange: a light in one of the second-floor windows. The house had been abandoned for years, its gates rusted and sagging, paint peeling from the siding. Local legend said it had been empty since the previous owners had disappeared without explanation. People in town whispered about screams heard on stormy nights, shadows moving behind broken curtains, lights flickering when no one was inside. Daniel had never believed the stories, chalking them up to small-town superstition. But tonight, with the storm pressing down, his steps slowed as he stared at the window. The light was small, almost like a candle, swaying slightly, and yet the silhouette of a figure could be seen behind it, unmoving, watching. Daniel shivered and quickened his pace. He told himself it was probably someone squatting, a homeless person taking shelter from the storm. But as he turned the corner, he heard it, the faintest scrape, like shoes dragging across gravel, behind him. His heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, but the street was empty. Only the rain and the wind answered him. He took another step, and the sound came again, closer this time. He began walking faster, then broke into a run. The street seemed endless, the darkness swallowing him whole. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the sensation that something was following him, something that didn't belong. When he finally reached the small convenience store at the edge of town, Daniel threw open the door and bolted inside. The bell above the door jingled, and the clerk, an older man with a wiry beard, looked up from behind the counter. "Rough night out there, huh?" he said, his voice low, almost cautious. Daniel tried to catch his breath and nodded, pointing vaguely toward the door. "Yeah, something. Something was following me." The clerk's eyes flicked to the storm outside, then back to Daniel, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "People see things in storms," he said, his voice flat. "It's nothing." Daniel nodded again, not entirely convinced. He bought a bottle of water, fumbled with the cash, and left, the door jingling behind him. But as soon as he stepped back into the rain, the sensation returned, the feeling of eyes on him, of a presence just beyond his vision. He turned, scanning the street, but saw nothing. And then he noticed movement in the alleyway beside the store, a shadow darting between the dumpsters, moving faster than any human should be able to. Daniel froze, heart hammering, and for a moment the rain and wind were gone. Everything was silent. The shadow seemed to pause, and he felt, rather than saw, the weight of its gaze. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his body refused. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the shadow emerged from the alley. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Daniel could feel the eyes on him, cold and empty, boring into his soul. The air around it seemed to distort, warping the rain, bending the light from the street lamps. Daniel turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. The streets were a blur of water and darkness. The figure followed, silent, gliding more than walking, never faltering, always closing the distance. He ran past the old church, past rows of shuttered houses, past the park where the trees groaned under the wind. And yet, no matter how fast he ran, the shadow remained, always just behind, always watching. Finally, Daniel reached the bridge that spanned the creek on the outskirts of town. He stumbled onto the wooden planks, soaked through, shivering, chest burning from exertion. And then he saw it. The shadow had stopped at the far end, waiting. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the fog rising off the creek, were more shapes, all tall, all silent, all watching. They moved with a fluid grace, stepping from the darkness as though the night itself had birthed them. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to move, to jump, to run. But the bridge felt endless, and the creatures didn't hurry. They simply watched, silent and patient. He backed up, heart racing, until his heel slipped on the wet wood. He fell, sprawling across the planks, and looked up. One of them had moved closer, tilting its head unnaturally as it regarded him. The others didn't follow, didn't approach. They simply waited, a sea of impossible shapes, their forms wavering in and out of reality like smoke in the wind. In the blink of an eye, Daniel heard it, the whispers, low, sibilant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come, Stay, join us. The words weren't spoken aloud, but they filled his mind, curling around his thoughts, wrapping him in cold fingers of dread. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged. He tried to move, but the bridge felt heavier, as if gravity itself had shifted, pinning him in place. Then one stepped forward. It moved differently than the others, almost human in motion, but still wrong. Its hand extended, fingers long and thin, stretching beyond reason. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears, his head, his chest. Daniel's vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, and he felt the cold touch of its fingers before he even saw them. And then he woke, or thought he did. He was in his bed, drenched in sweat, the storm outside still raging, the lamp casting its dim glow across the room. His heart pounded and he shook, trying to convince himself it was a nightmare. But the feeling remained. The house was too quiet, too still. And when he glanced toward his window, he saw it. One of the shapes pressed against the glass, watching, its hooded form silhouetted against the streetlight, unmoving, waiting. Days passed, but the shadow didn't leave. It didn't retreat, didn't vanish in daylight. It was always there, lurking in the corners of his vision, reflected in mirrors outside his window in the streets when he dared to step out. Daniel stopped leaving the apartment, stopped speaking to anyone. Friends called, but he didn't answer. Food arrived at his door, left by neighbors who had begun to whisper about him. They said he looked sick, haunted, and though they worried, no one dared enter his apartment, not when the nights were so dark and the wind carried whispers that sounded like screams. At night, the dreams returned. Only now they were more vivid, more insistent. He was always running, always chased, always falling through the storm-slicked streets of Ashfield, never able to escape. And the shadows grew in number, more and more of them, always watching, always waiting, whispering promises of pain, of eternity, of joining them in the darkness. Daniel tried to resist, tried to fight them, but he could feel himself weakening, the line between waking and dreaming dissolving under the weight of the endless night. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel became a shell of the man he had once been. The apartment filled with notes, scribbled warnings to himself in a shaky hand, a desperate attempt to remember reality. The whispers never ceased, not for a moment. Sometimes he thought he heard the creatures moving inside the walls, just beyond the reach of sight. Sometimes he swore he felt a hand brush his shoulder in the dark, though no one was there. And always, always, they waited at the window, patient and eternal. One night, Daniel knew it was coming. The storm was worse than ever, rain lashing the windows, wind screaming like a chorus of the damned, the shadows pressed closer, whispering louder, promising the end. And then in the corner of the room he saw it, the figure moving toward him, step by impossible step until it was only inches away. Its face remained featureless, a void, but he could feel the hunger behind it, the promise of finality. He tried to run, to fight, but his body betrayed him. He fell backward, and the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him entirely was the shapes multiplying, filling the room, waiting to claim him. The next morning, the apartment was empty. No trace of Daniel remained, save for the faint smudges of water on the floor and the window pressed with an outline that looked vaguely human. The neighbors whispered, as they always do, about storms and shadows and the things that linger when the night is too dark. And in the streets of Ashfield, the rain continued to fall, thick and heavy, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispers, promising that the darkness was patient, eternal, and hungry for the next soul foolish enough to wander into its grasp. Story the end. The rain had been falling for hours, the steady drumming on the roof of my apartment, turning the streets outside into rivers of dark, churning water. The air was heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and decaying leaves. I had just finished my late shift at the diner, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as I cleaned up the last of the tables, and I was looking forward to a warm shower and a night of sleep. But there was something in the air tonight, something that didn't feel right. The kind of night where shadows seem to move just beyond your peripheral vision, and every creak and groan of the old building feels like someone watching you. I stepped out into the storm, pulling my hood tight around my face. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passing car whose headlights illuminated the rain in jagged white streaks. I pulled my jacket tighter, shivering despite the layers. There was a street lamp a few blocks down that flickered constantly, casting intermittent light on the puddles that had gathered in the cracked pavement. I always hated that street lamp. Something about the way it glowed, just enough to hint at shapes that might not really be there, shadows that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the storm. I quickened my pace, boots splashing in the water. As I turned the corner onto Elm Street, a sense of unease washed over me. The houses were old, their paint peeling in streaks, shutters swinging loosely on rusted hinges. It was a part of town most people avoided at night, even in good weather. But the shortcut home cut through here, and I was too tired to argue with myself. I passed the old Mitchell place, a two-story Victorian that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The windows were dark, the porch sagging under the weight of years of neglect. I almost didn't notice the faint light flickering in one of the upstairs windows. Just for a moment, a pale glow that vanished when I blinked. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Probably a reflection, maybe lightning catching on broken glass. My feet moved faster, and the sound of my own breathing in the rain seemed to fill the air, pressing against me from all sides. I had almost made it past the house when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound from the yard behind the Mitchell place, like metal scraping against concrete. My stomach clenched, and I froze. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was the wind, debris in the yard being pushed along by the storm. I forced my legs to move again, every step heavier than the last. Halfway down the block, I thought I saw someone standing in the shadows near the end of the street. A figure, tall, motionless, watching me. I stopped again, squinting through the sheets of rain. My heart began to pound in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to react to my presence. I considered crossing the street, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Finally, I broke into a run, telling myself it was just someone waiting for a ride, or maybe a neighbor checking on the storm. My rational mind was a thin veneer over the growing panic. By the time I reached my building, my clothes were soaked, clinging to my skin, my hair plastered to my forehead. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. Inside, the lobby was dim, the emergency lights casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I checked the stairwell door. It was locked tight, and the elevator had that familiar hum, its single bulb flickering. Normally, I would have taken the stairs, but tonight I wanted the elevator. I stepped in, pressing the button for the fourth floor, and waited. The doors closed slowly, and for a moment I was enveloped in darkness, the hum of the motor the only sound. The elevator jerked slightly as it moved, and I felt a prickle along my spine. I glanced at the mirrored walls, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. Of course, there was no one, just my reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. The doors opened with a soft ding, and I hurried out, slipping into the hallway of my floor. The corridor was silent, the kind of silence that makes you notice every tiny sound. The drip of water somewhere down the hall, the soft creak of the building settling, the distant rumble of thunder. I unlocked my apartment door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the change. The warmth and familiarity I had expected weren't there. The air felt heavy, almost thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. I flicked on the lights, but only half the bulbs worked, leaving the room in a patchwork of dim pools and dark corners. I hung my wet jacket on the hook by the door, the fabric still dripping, and then went to the kitchen to make coffee, hoping the normalcy of routine would calm my nerves. The coffee maker gurgled as it brewed, and I leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the rain. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I froze, straining to hear it over the storm. It came again, slow, deliberate, as if someone were rapping their knuckles lightly against the glass. I shook my head, convincing myself it was a branch from one of the trees outside, battered by the wind. But then the tapping continued, moving in a pattern, almost like a rhythm, and I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone or something was outside my window. My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone was on the charger across the room. I told myself to stay calm, to not make a scene. Slowly, I edged toward the window, careful not to make sudden movements. I peeked through the blinds, but the rain distorted everything outside. For a moment, I thought I saw a face. Pale, indistinct but unmistakably human, staring at me through the storm. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and suffocating. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that exhaustion and the storm were playing tricks on me. I turned back to the kitchen, attempting to finish my coffee. But as I lifted the mug, I heard it again. Not at the window this time, behind me. Slow, dragging footsteps across the hardwood floor. My blood ran cold. I live alone. There is no one here. I told myself this over and over, but the sound was unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate, moving closer. I dropped the mug. It shattered on the floor, coffee spreading in dark, sticky patterns. The footsteps stopped. I froze, barely breathing. And then I heard a whisper. My name. Soft, almost gentle, but the tone was wrong. Wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I whipped around, but the apartment was empty. Every shadow seemed to move, stretch, and twitch in the flickering light. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Maybe a neighbor? But the walls are thick, and no one should be able to hear me. Maybe a burglar? But why would they whisper my name? And why hadn't they broken in? I backed toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning every dark corner. That's when I noticed it, the reflection in the broken pieces of my coffee mug. At first I thought it was my imagination, but there was a figure behind me, hunched, pale, eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, just watched. I froze. It was tall, impossibly thin, limbs that seemed too long for a human frame. The face was pale, almost translucent, with a twisted, hollow grin that didn't reach the eyes. I stumbled backward, tripping over my rug, heart racing. When I looked again, it was gone. Just my reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. I ran to the door, yanking it open, but the hallway was empty. The building was silent except for the storm outside. I considered going down to the lobby, calling for help, but something stopped me. A sense of dread, a pull in my chest that whispered, I shouldn't leave. I turned back into the apartment. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking violently. I clicked the flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the room. Every shadow seemed deeper, almost liquid in the dim light. That's when I heard it again, whispering, my name, closer this time. I spun in the direction of the sound. The beam of my flashlight landed on the living room mirror. The reflection was wrong. I was there, but behind me, the figure from the mug shard stood, its grin wider, more grotesque. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the couch. The flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning in a circle, and when I managed to grab it again, the figure was gone. I ran to the bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer. Every instinct screamed that whatever was in my apartment wasn't human. I had tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. The storm had knocked out the lines. I was alone. Completely alone. And yet, I could hear it moving outside the bedroom door. Slow, deliberate, dragging, whispering, taunting. My name. Hours passed. I lost track of time, sitting in the corner of my bedroom with the knife clutched in my hands, listening to the storm outside and the noises that weren't from the storm. The wind rattled the windows, the rain pounded on the roof, but underneath it all was the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging closer and closer. Sometimes the whispers stopped, leaving a silence so complete it hurt. Then, when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, they would start again. Eventually, I heard a different sound. The slow, deliberate creak of the bedroom door handle. My heart stopped. The door didn't open, but I knew it would. I pressed myself into the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, as invisible as possible. The handle turned slightly. A breath of cold air swept into the room, and then I saw it, just in the crack under the door. A shadow, long and thin, stretching impossibly across the floor. The whisper came again. My name, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every syllable. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning. The storm finally began to die down outside, and with it the noises in my apartment began to fade. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, the apartment was empty. No sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew. I had felt it, seen it, heard it. My apartment was no longer my own. I never slept in that apartment again. I moved out within the week, leaving behind everything that couldn't fit in my car. Friends asked why I left so suddenly, but I couldn't tell them. They would think I was crazy. Even now, years later, I can't explain it fully. I just know that on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the rain lashes against the windows, I remember the whispers, the dragging footsteps, the eyes that stared through me, and I know that whatever it was, it didn't leave with me. It waits, patient, watching, whispering my name. Story the end. It had been raining all day, the kind of relentless gray drizzle that seeps into the bones and blurs the line between afternoon and night. The roads shimmered wetly under the streetlights, casting distorted reflections of passing cars, and the trees along the avenue swayed in the wind, their skeletal branches scratching at the windows as if warning anyone inside to stay put. Marcy had been driving for hours, trying to get home from her aunt's place in the countryside, a place she rarely visited anymore. Her GPS had stopped working sometime back on Route 117, and the cellular signal was patchy at best. The sky was a solid wall of charcoal clouds, and every time lightning forked across it, Marcy could see the empty stretches of farmland she was passing, fields drowned in darkness, barns long abandoned, and puddles that seemed unnaturally still, like glass reflecting something that shouldn't exist. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of her old sedan in a deafening rhythm. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching her own tired eyes. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, her coat soaked through, and her hands cramped around the steering wheel. She thought about stopping at the next gas station, but every time she glanced ahead, all she could see were more fields, more darkness, and nothing else. Then came the first strange sign, a figure on the side of the road. She swerved slightly, heart hammering. The shape was unmistakably human, though its features were impossible to make out in the rain. It didn't wave or signal for a ride. It just stood there, head tilted, shoulders slumped, facing her as she passed. The rain blurred it into something unreal, yet the hairs on her neck stood on end. When she looked again, it was gone. There had been no shoulder, no driveway, no sign of where it could have vanished. Marcy shook her head. "I'm tired," like she whispered aloud. "It's just exhaustion." But the unease clung to her like wet clothes. She remembered her aunt warning her before she left. That stretch of Route 117, people don't like to drive it at night. Strange things happen out there. She had laughed it off then, thinking her aunt was exaggerating, but now the words felt like a chill crawling down her spine. A few miles later, the engine coughed and sputtered. The fuel gauge, which she had checked just an hour ago, now teetered near empty. "Great," she muttered, pulling over at the edge of the road. Her headlights illuminated a small patch of grass that led to a dirt path. It didn't look like anyone used it, but there was a faint glow further down, as if a lantern was swinging back and forth in the fog. Curiosity mingled with fear, and despite the heavy rain, Marcy grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The cold wind immediately bit through her wet coat, but she forced herself down the path, drawn by the light. Every step she took squelched in the mud, and every rustle of leaves sounded like whispers she couldn't understand. The lantern grew brighter, revealing an old, decrepit house that shouldn't have existed in the middle of nowhere. Its paint was peeling, windows shattered or boarded up, and the front door hung off its hinges. But what made her stomach twist wasn't the decay, it was the smell. Damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, like something had been rotting there for weeks. She hesitated, shining her flashlight into the doorway. The light revealed a narrow hallway, lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to crawl in the shadows. There was movement at the end of the hall, just a slight swaying, but she could see no one. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she was alone in the dark, and the house was the only place with any semblance of shelter. Trembling, she stepped inside. The interior was worse than she had imagined. Water dripped from the ceiling, puddles formed in the corners, and the air was thick with dust and rot. Her footsteps echoed as she advanced, and somewhere deep in the house, a low groan responded. She froze, holding her breath, listening. The groan came again, longer this time, followed by something scraping across the floorboards above her. Marcy's pulse quickened. She whispered, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The only answer was silence, then the sudden crash of what sounded like furniture toppling upstairs. Her rational mind screamed that the house must be abandoned, that rats or some other animals were making the noise, but her gut told her otherwise. As she reached the living room, she noticed strange markings on the walls, scratches, carved letters, something that might have been a name but was too distorted to read. The lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the hallway appear to stretch unnaturally. A chill rolled down her back as the air seemed to thicken, pressing against her lungs. She turned toward the staircase, hesitating, when a whisper came from somewhere above. "Don't go." It was faint, yet clear, like the voice of a child pleading, but it carried a weight that made her knees buckle. Before she could react, the front door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She spun around, flashlight swinging, but there was no wind, no logical cause for the door to move. Panic set in and she ran to the door, pulling and shaking it, but it was as if it had fused with the frame. That's when she heard it, a slow, deliberate step on the stairs above, echoing against the wooden beams, coming closer. Marcy backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her eyes darted around, looking for anywhere to hide, but the furniture was broken, scattered, and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. The steps stopped. Silence. Then, from the darkness above, a low laugh. It wasn't human. It vibrated with malice, with something older than fear itself. The light flickered, and in that brief flash Marcy saw them. Figures, many of them, pale and elongated, their faces twisted into impossible smiles. They didn't move, yet they were everywhere, reflected in the shattered mirrors, the puddles, the windows. Her chest tightened, and she realized she could barely breathe. The whispering returned, not from above, but from all around her. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." Instinct took over. Marcy turned and ran toward what she thought was the back door, but the house had shifted. The hallway stretched, walls bending, and the door she had seen moments ago was now just another wall. Each step she took seemed to echo into eternity, as if the house was alive, feeding off her fear. Shadows danced, forming shapes that moved independently of the flickering lantern. She screamed, but her voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Somewhere behind her, the laughter grew louder, closer. She felt a cold, dry hand brush against her arm, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a broken table. She dared a glance backward. Nothing human, nothing even remotely alive, but the air itself seemed twisted, distorted, as if reality was fraying at the edges. Marcy's mind raced, trying to find an explanation, a way out, but the house refused logic. It mocked her with hallways that led back into the same room, doors that opened into walls, windows that reflected her terrified face instead of the outside world. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, she couldn't tell. Time had no meaning here. Every attempt to escape ended the same way. More shadows, more whispers, more shapes pressing closer. She sank to the floor, sobbing, exhausted, her body trembling uncontrollably. And then she noticed something new. The walls were crawling. Slowly, impossibly, letters formed in the plaster. "Stay. Forever." Marcy screamed, covering her eyes, but the whispers became voices, chanting, each word a dagger in her mind. "Forever, forever, forever." The figures appeared again, pressing closer, reaching for her. The air thickened, the room spinning, her vision flickering like a broken film reel. She tried to run again, only to find herself back in the center of the living room, the lantern swinging above her as if caught in a storm. She realized then that the house didn't want her to leave. It wanted her to become part of it, to be absorbed into its endless night. She collapsed, tears blinding her, as the first hands grabbed her shoulders. Cold, wet, impossible hands that slipped through her coat like smoke, pulling her upright. The figures closed in, faceless, and the whispers became deafening, echoing in her skull, repeating the same word over and over. Alone, alone, alone. Marcy's screams were absorbed into the walls, swallowed whole as if she had never existed outside this place. And then everything went black. Somewhere, far away, the rain continued to fall over Route 117. A lone sedan sat parked at the edge of the road, its headlights flickering weakly. Inside, the engine was cold, untouched, and the driver's seat was empty. Only the puddles in the surrounding fields reflected a faint, distorted glow, as if the house itself had vanished, leaving no trace of the terror that had consumed the night. Drivers passing the stretch of road in the weeks that followed would sometimes swear they saw a figure standing in the rain, head tilted, shoulders slumped. But when anyone slowed down, tried to stop, the figure would vanish, leaving behind only a chill in the air and the whispering of something old and hungry, waiting for the next traveler to wander too far from the light. Locals avoided Route 117 after dark. Those who dared to drive it alone at night often returned shaken, silent, their eyes wide with memories they couldn't describe. Marcy was never seen again, though some said they could hear her voice, faintly calling from the trees during a storm. Don't go, don't go. The house was never found again. Some insisted it had never existed, that it was a trick of the weather, of fatigue, of imagination running wild in the dark. But those who had traveled the road on nights like that swore it was real. They could feel it in their bones, the oppressive weight of something waiting, watching, hungry for those who dared to drive alone under a sky so gray it seemed to blot out the world itself. The storm clouds would roll in, the wind would howl, and in the distance, faintly, the echoes of a door slamming shut, and a voice crying out in terror could be heard if you listened closely enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, the glow of a lantern would appear at the edge of the fields, swaying gently in the rain, as if inviting the next traveler to come closer, to see, to never leave. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the sky hung heavy with darkness, a suffocating cloak that seemed to press down on the town of Millfield. Rain had been falling intermittently all day, leaving puddles along cracked asphalt and the smell of wet earth lingering in the air. Streetlights flickered sporadically, their weak yellow glow struggling against the thickening gloom. The wind moaned through the skeletal trees lining the outskirts of town, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that no one could quite place. Most residents had already shuttered their windows, drawn their curtains, and turned on every available light, trying in vain to push back the growing sense of unease. Daniel Carver had just finished his shift at the Millfield paper mill, a massive aging structure that had long been rumored to be cursed. On ordinary nights, the rhythmic drone of machinery and the hiss of steam were enough to lull the workers into a dull routine, but tonight the noises seemed exaggerated, distorted, like the building itself was groaning under some unseen weight. Daniel had worked there for nearly a decade and prided himself on his calm demeanor, yet he could feel a knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach as he climbed into his black pickup truck. The road home was deserted, slick with rain, and the low clouds swallowed any hint of the moon. Daniel's headlights illuminated the wet asphalt ahead, but beyond that, darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. He passed the old Miller farmhouse, abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, the roof sagging as though it were bowing under some immense pressure. Every time he drove past it, Daniel felt a chill in his chest, but tonight the sense of dread was sharper, more immediate, like the house itself was aware of him. As he drove, his mind kept returning to the rumors he had overheard at work. Stories of workers who had left the mill in the dead of night and never come back, tales of shadows moving just beyond the reach of streetlights, whispers that spoke from nowhere. Daniel had dismissed them all as drunken tales or the product of overactive imaginations, but now, with the rain drumming against the windshield and the darkness pressing in from all sides, he found himself glancing nervously at the edges of the road, half expecting something to leap out. When he reached his street, Daniel slowed the truck, the headlights illuminating the familiar rows of houses, each one dark and silent. But then he noticed something odd. A single light flickering in the house directly across from his. That was strange in itself, but what made it worse was the fact that the figure in the window didn't move, didn't shift. It was just standing there, watching. Daniel squinted through the rain, trying to make out details, but the figure remained an indistinct shadow, a dark blot against the warm glow of the lamp. Shaking his head, Daniel told himself he was imagining things. Maybe it was a neighbor who had forgotten to turn off a lamp. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, the warmth of his house doing little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. He went about his usual routine, checking the locks, making a cup of coffee, turning on the television, but the sense of being watched never left. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the siding sounded like it was amplified, like the house itself was listening. By 10 o'clock, Daniel decided he needed sleep. He went upstairs, locked his bedroom door, and crawled under the blankets. But as soon as his eyes closed, the dreams began. Or perhaps they weren't dreams. He was standing in the middle of the rain-slicked street, but the world around him was wrong. The houses were distorted, leaning at impossible angles, their windows dark and empty. And then he saw it. The figure from across the street, standing in the middle of the road now, closer, and it had changed. Its outline was vaguely human, but the proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. Daniel's heart slammed in his chest, and he wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the asphalt. The figure lifted one elongated hand and pointed at him, and that was when he realized something even more horrifying. It wasn't his imagination. He could hear the whispers now, a low, sibilant chorus that seemed to come from the figure itself, promising pain, promising the kind of terror that could burrow into your very soul. He woke with a start, sweat running down his face, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if the sound he had heard, the whispers, had come from the dream or the real world. The house was silent, too silent. Even the rain seemed to have stopped. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed, trying to shake off the dream when he noticed movement in the window across the street. The lamp was off now, but the shadow was still there. His pulse quickened. It wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything, but the mere presence of it filled the room with an oppressive sense of dread. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows, a reflection, a tree branch, but the fear in his chest was growing, gnawing at the edges of reason. Daniel grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the cold night air slicing against his wet skin. He walked across the street, squinting at the house, trying to see through the darkened windows. The front door was closed, locked, no sign of life inside, but when he reached the porch, he saw something etched into the dust on the window. A single word scrawled in shaky, uneven letters. Wait. His stomach turned. He wanted to run, but his legs felt leaden. And then the whispers began again, soft at first, almost drowned out by the rain now returning in fits, but growing louder, more insistent, surrounding him from all sides. Wait, 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 they hissed, echoing in the darkness. Daniel stumbled back toward his truck, fumbling with the keys, but the shadows seemed to have multiplied, stretching along the ground, creeping toward him like liquid darkness. When he finally slammed the door of his truck shut, the engine refused to start. The headlights flickered, casting long, grotesque shapes on the street. And then he saw it move. Out of the corner of his eye, the figure stepping off the porch and gliding toward him. Not walking, not running, but floating, impossibly silent, its form rippling like smoke in the dim light. Daniel's hands shook as he tried the ignition again, the engine coughing to life after what felt like an eternity. He slammed the truck into gear and tore down the street, rain lashing against the windshield, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. Every mirror, every reflection in the passing windows of abandoned stores seemed to contain that same tall, thin figure, watching, waiting. The whispers were constant now, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Wait, wait, wait. Daniel reached the highway and tried to calm himself, taking deep breaths, telling himself he was being paranoid. Maybe it was just stress, maybe the combination of long hours at the mill and the storm. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the headlights of another vehicle, far too close, keeping pace with him despite the emptiness of the road. No one was behind the wheel, at least no human form he could see, and the shape of the car was wrong, angular, almost too dark, absorbing the rain instead of reflecting it. Panic set in fully now. He swerved, trying to lose the phantom car, but every turn seemed to lead him back onto the same stretch of highway. The storm intensified, wind howling, rain turning the road into a slick, treacherous ribbon. Daniel's hands were slick on the wheel, and his vision blurred with both fear and the rain streaking his windshield. And then the whispers merged into a single voice, cold, hollow, unmistakably close. Stop, or join us. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The truck skidded on the wet asphalt, spinning out of control, and he slammed into the guardrail. The impact threw him forward, but miraculously, he was alive. Dazed, he tried to get out, but the door was jammed. That's when he saw it, standing beside the truck, its presence impossible to ignore now. The figure's face, or what passed for a face, was featureless. a smooth void where eyes and mouth should have been, yet Daniel could feel it staring directly into him. Its hand reached toward the window, fingers stretching impossibly long, brushing the rain-streaked glass. Everything inside Daniel screamed to fight, to run, to survive back, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of inevitability. The whispers had become a roar in his mind, filling every corner, every thought, drowning out reason. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rain stopped, the wind ceased, and the world went utterly silent. The figure was gone. The whispering stopped. Only the faint hum of the engine remained, and Daniel, shaking, soaked, and trembling, realized the truck was no longer on the highway, but parked in front of his own driveway. The familiar sight of his house should have been comforting, but the shadow in the window remained, now at the corner of the room, closer than before, waiting. Daniel never slept again. He kept lights on, every lamp burning, curtains wide open, but the shadows didn't care. They moved in the corners of his vision, in the reflections, in the rain-drenched streets outside his window. The whispers never stopped. Every night he could hear them, growing louder, more insistent, promising that one day they would claim him fully. And Daniel knew, deep down, that the night he saw the figure in the storm wasn't an isolated incident. It had been an invitation, and the darkness was patient, eternal, and hungry. The town of Millfield continued its quiet existence, oblivious to the horrors that lurked just beyond perception. But Daniel's life had become a waking nightmare, a constant vigilance against the things that waited in the shadows, things that fed on fear, things that were patient enough to wait until the stormy nights came again. Nights like this one, nights that promised evil, nights that promised the end. Story the end. It had been raining all day, the kind of rain that didn't simply fall. It seeped into the air, soaked into your clothes, and lingered like a warning. The streets of the small town of Mill Creek were slick with water, reflecting the dull glow of the streetlights in distorted patterns. Leaves clung stubbornly to the asphalt, swept along only by the occasional gust of wind that made the trees creak and groan. Most of the town's residents had long since retreated to their homes, leaving the streets eerily empty, except for the occasional car that splashed through puddles. Jason Parker didn't mind the rain. He had always found a strange comfort in gloomy weather, though tonight felt different. Tonight, something gnawed at the edges of his mind, a sensation he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to focus on his driving. He was returning from a late shift at the convenience store on the edge of town, a job he had taken after being laid off from his old office. The rain had started mid-afternoon, and now, as he drove along the winding back roads that led to his apartment, it fell with a persistent, almost deliberate rhythm. The road curved sharply to the left, and Jason slowed, gripping the wheel tightly. The forest flanking the road was dense and dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. He switched on his high beams, hoping to catch any movement ahead, but the rain blurred everything into an indistinguishable gray haze. A chill ran down his spine. He shook his head, telling himself it was just the isolation, the darkness, and the fatigue from working a 12-hour shift. But the feeling wouldn't leave him. He felt, watched. About a mile down the road, Jason noticed something unusual, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be a hitchhiker, but as he slowed, he realized the figure wasn't moving. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old trench coat, soaked through, his head tilted down as if he were staring at the ground. Jason's first instinct was to pass him, but something in the man's posture, the stillness, made him uneasy. He slowed further, his headlights illuminating the figure's face. But the man's head snapped up in perfect synchronization with Jason's approach, revealing a face pale and featureless, except for hollow black pits where his eyes should have been. Jason's heart leapt into his throat. He slammed the brakes, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. When he looked again, the man was gone. No footprints in the muddy shoulder, no puddle disturbances, nothing. Jason's hands shook, and he forced his eyes to stay on the road, convincing himself it had been a trick of the light, a reflection in the rain. But the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the back of his neck. He drove on, every shadow seeming to flicker at the corner of his vision. When he reached the turn that led directly to his apartment complex, he stopped at the red light, trying to steady his breathing. And then he saw them. Two headlights parked across the intersection, angled toward him. No engine noise. No movement inside the car, just the lights, glaring, unwavering. He instinctively revved the engine and pulled forward as soon as the light turned green, keeping his speed slightly above the limit, though the rain made every curve dangerous. The car remained parallel to him, moving in sync despite no sound of an engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The headlights weren't behind him anymore. They were on the opposite side of the street, then ahead, and then suddenly gone. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of his apartment, his hands were numb, his chest tight with panic. He parked quickly and bolted inside, locking the door behind him. The dim hallway lights flickered as he ran past, and he pressed himself against the door of his apartment, listening. At first, there was only the sound of the rain on the roof. Then came a faint tapping, soft, rhythmic, almost imperceptible. He froze, straining his ears. The tapping grew louder, coming from the window beside his door. Slowly, Jason turned toward the window. There was nothing outside. Only the rain, only the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. He exhaled sharply, trying to laugh off the fear, telling himself he was tired, imagining things. He slid the deadbolt into place and decided he would make some tea to calm down. As he walked into the kitchen, the lights flickered violently and a sharp crash echoed from the living room. Jason froze. The kitchen knife in his hand suddenly felt useless. He crept toward the living room, every instinct screaming to run, but his curiosity anchored him. When he rounded the corner, his blood ran cold. His sofa, a simple piece of furniture he had bought from a local store, was flipped upside down. The cushions were gone. On the carpet, wet footprints led to the corner of the room, and then stopped. Jason swallowed hard and glanced at the window. No one. Just the relentless, heavy rain. He decided to call his friend Matt, who lived a few blocks away. His hands trembled as he dialed the number. Matt answered on the second ring, groggy and annoyed. Jason barely managed to get a word out before a sharp click cut the call off. Confused, he tried again. No answer. The line was dead. Then came the sound. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It came from behind him. Jason. He spun around. The apartment was empty. Nothing moved. But the whisper repeated, louder this time, closer, and this time followed by another sound. Dragging. Something heavy, moving across the floor. Jason backed toward the kitchen, tripping over the counter stool. The dragging sound followed, stopping just as he reached the refrigerator. Panic overtook him. He grabbed his coat and keys and ran for the stairwell, deciding to escape to the lobby and call the police. But when he stepped out, the hallway stretched endlessly before him. The lights flickered in a sickening rhythm, shadows twisting unnaturally. He ran, calling out for anyone, but the building was dead silent, except for the oppressive sound of the rain through the vents. Every step he took seemed to echo like a drumbeat of doom. When he reached the front door, he tried the handle. Locked. He wasn't sure if he had locked it earlier or if it had been locked all along. Panic surged. From somewhere above, a low, guttural laugh reverberated through the stairwell. Jason froze, heart hammering. The laugh grew, echoing, multiplying, surrounding him from every direction. Then came footsteps, fast, deliberate, coming down the stairwell. Jason bolted into the nearest apartment, banging on the door of his neighbor, Mrs. Klein, an elderly woman known for her strange habits. No answer. He tried the next door. Empty. Each apartment he entered was either empty or dark, the residents nowhere in sight. The building itself seemed to pulse with some malevolent presence, the walls vibrating subtly as if alive. He returned to the stairwell, desperate, and began to climb, ignoring the fatigue that made his legs feel like lead. He had reached the third floor when he noticed something chilling. Every door was open, the interiors blackened, with shadows moving inside, stretching toward him as he passed. He heard whispers, voices speaking in unison, chanting his name. He tried to run, but the hallway seemed to elongate, twisting unnaturally, the floors tilting and slanting as if to make him fall. On the fourth floor, he finally found a door with a faint light inside. He burst in, slamming it behind him, and collapsed. The room was empty, a simple bedroom with a bed, dresser, and a single window. But in the reflection of the mirror he saw them, figures, tall and indistinct, standing at the corners of the room, watching. When he turned, there was nothing. But the feeling remained, heavy and suffocating. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. Trembling, he answered. It was a text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have come back. He dropped the phone. The whispering returned, this time surrounding him completely. The figures in the corners of the room had moved closer, just beyond perception, like shapes out of the corner of the eye. Jason tried to scream, but no sound came out. He backed into the wall, shoving the bed behind him, trying to put distance between himself and the shadows that now seemed to press forward, seeping into the room. Then the window shattered. Rain exploded into the room, soaking him. Something cold and wet wrapped around his ankle. He looked down. Nothing, but the dragging continued, climbing up his leg. He kicked wildly, tearing himself free, only to realize the floor beneath him had changed. The carpet was gone, replaced with wet mud, like he had stepped into a trench. The walls were now trees, twisted and black, their branches scratching at the ceiling. He was no longer in his apartment. The whispers became voices, screaming now, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. He ran blindly, branches slashing at him, the ground slick and treacherous. He fell repeatedly, mud clinging to him, soaking his clothes. The rain had stopped, replaced with a choking fog. Shapes moved within it, figures emerging briefly before disappearing again. He could feel them around him, breathing on him, laughing at him. Hours or maybe minutes passed in this nightmare forest. Time lost all meaning. He stumbled into a clearing. At the center was a figure, the same faceless man from the road earlier, standing perfectly still. Jason froze. The man raised a hand. The whispers ceased instantly. The forest fell silent. Then the figure spoke in a voice that was everywhere and nowhere. You can't leave. Not tonight. Not ever. Jason screamed. The figure advanced, and then everything went black. He woke up in his apartment, or at least he thought it was his apartment. The rain had stopped, leaving a suffocating stillness. But as he moved to check the door, he noticed something impossible. His apartment had no walls, no ceiling, just endless darkness stretching in every direction. And in the distance, he saw shapes moving toward him, slow, deliberate, and countless. They whispered his name, inviting him to join them in the endless gloom. Jason ran, but there was nowhere to go. The figures multiplied, the shadows growing heavier, pressing in on him from all sides. The air itself seemed alive, thick and choking. He tried to call for help, but no words escaped. The shapes enveloped him, and the whispers turned into a roar, drowning out all thought, all reason, all hope. Outside, Mill Creek remained quiet, the streets glistening in the aftermath of the rain. No lights flickered, no sirens sounded. The town slept peacefully, oblivious to the horror that had claimed one of its own on a gloomy, evil night. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the edges of reality, Jason's screams continued, mingling with the whispers, trapped forever in a nightmare that had no beginning and no end. Story the end. The sky over the small town of Ashwood had been a dense, bruised gray all day, pressing down on the streets and rooftops like a warning. By evening, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the sharp tang of wet leaves and the distant scent of wood smoke from dying fireplaces. Streetlights flickered uneasily along the main road, the old bulbs struggling against the thickening gloom. Cars passed in intermittent bursts of sound and light, tires splashing through the half-frozen puddles that lined the curbs. Ashwood was normally quiet at night, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. But tonight, a peculiar tension hummed through the air, a sort of expectation that something unseen was waiting just beyond the periphery. Evelyn Harper was driving home from her shift at the hospital, her old sedan rattling along the uneven pavement. The radio played faintly, a low murmur of static and soft, melancholy music that matched the grayness outside. She had been exhausted all week, catching barely enough sleep to feel functional. But tonight, the drive home seemed heavier than usual. The darkness pressed against her windshield, shadows stretching across the road in shapes that weren't entirely natural. Trees leaned like skeletal fingers over the street, their branches scratching at the car roof in the wind, and Evelyn's hands tightened around the steering wheel. As she passed the old Elmwood Cemetery, a place she'd walked by 100 times before, a sudden movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the figure didn't move like any creature she knew. It was upright, almost human in shape, though unnaturally still, standing near the edge of the gravestones. Her heart stuttered. She blinked, trying to shake off the illusion, but when she glanced again, it had vanished. Evelyn tried to focus on the road ahead, telling herself she was tired, imagining things. Yet the feeling didn't leave her. Every shadow beyond the headlights seemed to deepen unnaturally, and the silence from the cemetery was oppressive. Usually the town had a low hum of life, distant traffic, dogs barking, the occasional late-night chatter, but tonight nothing stirred. Even the wind seemed hesitant, carrying whispers that she could almost, but not quite, make out. When she turned onto Willow Lane, her street, the feeling escalated. The streetlights here were older, taller, and more fragile. One flickered as she approached, casting a brief, staccato illumination on the cracked pavement. Her own house came into view at the end of the lane, a small colonial with peeling white paint, its windows dark and vacant. The front yard was littered with autumn leaves, and a faint mist clung to the grass, rising like smoke from the cold earth. The mailbox leaned at an odd angle, as if someone, or something, had nudged it. Evelyn parked and shut off the car, the sudden quiet inside the vehicle more pronounced than the wind outside. She hesitated for a moment, listening, the hairs on her arms prickling. The house looked the same, but there was something wrong in the way the shadows clung to the corners, how the darkness behind the windows seemed thicker than it should be. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards doing nothing to reassure her. The living room was empty, the old clock ticking slowly, deliberately. She dropped her bag onto the couch and moved to the kitchen to make herself tea, the warmth of the room not quite reaching her bones. As she waited for the water to boil, a sudden sound stopped her mid-step, a faint, deliberate knocking coming from the basement door. It was slow, measured, and Evelyn froze, listening. Her mind raced. The house was hers alone. The neighbors were blocks away. Who would be down there? Gathering her courage, she descended the basement steps slowly, each creak of the old wood echoing like a scream in the empty house. The light above the furnace flickered and hummed weakly, casting long, wavering shadows. The knocking had stopped, replaced by a low scratching sound like fingernails tracing the wall. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts, and she reached for the nearest object, an old baseball bat, gripping it tightly. "Hello?" Her voice was trembling. "Is anyone there?" No answer came, only the scratching. Her flashlight from her phone pierced the gloom, revealing nothing but stacked boxes, dusty shelves, and the bare concrete walls. The sound shifted, now coming from the far corner near the furnace. She moved toward it cautiously, the bat raised. Then she saw it, a dark shape, hunched unnaturally, pressed against the wall, as if observing her. The shape moved with a speed that made her scream. It darted into the shadows, vanishing before her eyes. The basement felt colder now, the air thick and heavy. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, rapid and uneven. Something was here. Something not human. And it wasn't hiding. It was waiting. Evelyn backed up the stairs in a daze, slammed the basement door shut, and bolted it. Her entire body shook as she leaned against it, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Perhaps it was a raccoon that had found its way in, or an old piece of furniture shifting, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She could feel a presence, something malevolent, aware of her every move. She grabbed her phone, intending to call the police, but the screen remained black. No signal. She tried again, her fingers trembling. Still nothing. Even the radio in the living room had gone silent. The house was cut off from the world. Panic surged. She needed to leave, now. As she reached the front door, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Footprints in the frost on the front porch. Heavy, dark, not entirely human, leading from the edge of the yard to her doorstep. And then another sound, a soft, dragging step across the floor above her. Her apartment was 2 stories, and she lived alone. Whoever or whatever was in her house was upstairs now. Evelyn backed into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the block. The steps grew louder, deliberate, slow, and deliberate. A shadow passed under the crack of the living room door. She could see it now, a tall, distorted figure, its limbs too long, its head unnaturally tilted, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and it stopped, just standing in the doorway, as if savoring her fear. The lights flickered violently, then died, plunging the house into total darkness. Evelyn's flashlight barely illuminated the figure. It was thinner, taller, its face a void, black eyes glinting faintly. The smell hit her then, a rancid metallic stench that made her gag. It moved closer, silent now, a predator waiting to strike. She ran, stumbling up the stairs, the creature following. Every turn she took, it mirrored, always just steps behind. Her bedroom door was ahead. She slammed it shut, locking it and pressing herself against it, trying to calm her frantic breathing. But then the scratching started again on the other side of the door, like nails dragging along the wood. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just go away." The scratching stopped. Silence. Her body shook, but she dared a glance through the small crack under the door. Nothing. The room seemed empty. Maybe it had left. Maybe. Then her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, and she screamed. Behind her, the mirror fogged, though the air was cold and dry. Shapes began to form in it, elongated, twisting figures pressed against each other, their mouths opening impossibly wide, silent screams etched into their faces. They stared at her from the glass, moving closer, and she realized with dawning horror that the reflection wasn't her own anymore. The doorknob rattled violently, the sound echoing through the house. The figures in the mirror pressed closer. Evelyn's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible. She grabbed her phone from the dresser, hoping for some last connection to reality. The screen flickered to life. A single message appeared, one she hadn't typed. "We're already inside." The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in thick clouds. The lights in the mirror dimmed, and the shapes reached out from the glass, stretching impossibly into the room. Evelyn backed against the wall, knife shaking in her hand. Then the whispering started, low and sibilant, filling every corner of the room. "You can't hide. You belong to the night now." The window shattered suddenly, frost exploding inward. A hand, too long, clawed, impossibly thin, snatched the knife from her grip. The mirror cracked, the shapes erupting into the room with a deafening screech of voices, high and shrill. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Everything moved at once, a whirlwind of shadows and whispers, and then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. The shadows lingered, clinging to the corners, watching, waiting. The room was empty, or so it seemed. Morning came to Ashwood without fanfare. The streetlights blinked off as the sun rose weakly over the horizon, turning the sky a dull gray. Neighbors would later say they saw the house empty, doors and windows intact, the lights off. No sounds, no movement. The mailman would leave letters on the porch, wondering why the front door was always locked, why there were no footprints leading inside or out. Evelyn Harper was never seen again. Friends and family searched, questioned, and grieved, but there was no trace. The basement remained locked, the lights inside dead. Locals whispered about the house on Willow Lane, saying that sometimes late at night you could see shadows moving behind the curtains or hear scratching at the basement door. Children were warned not to walk past it, and even the police avoided it, claiming it gave them the chills. And on certain nights, when the sky turns the color of bruises and the wind carries a faint metallic tang, people swear they hear her voice, calling from somewhere far too close, whispering, "We're already inside." Story, the end. The night had already begun to sink into something heavy and unnatural when Sarah pulled into the narrow driveway of the old family cabin. The sky above was bruised a deep purple, clouded in heavy layers that swallowed the moon. She'd driven 6 hours from the city, alone, wanting solitude, hoping the isolation would clear her mind. The cabin, nestled deep in the Adirondacks, was a relic of her childhood summers. Dusty, creaking, forgotten, and she'd never spent a night there alone. She had been warned about it once by her grandmother in a hushed voice about the cabin's temper, but she brushed it off. Ghost stories, she thought. Nothing more. The tires crunched over the loose gravel as she stopped in front of the cabin. The air was unnervingly still. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a weighty silence that pressed against her chest. She got out of the car, the wind tugging at her coat, and looked up at the cabin. The wooden siding was gray with age, shingles missing from the roof, windows clouded with grime. She hadn't noticed it so foreboding as a child, but now, in the dying light of evening, it looked almost alive, almost waiting. She unlocked the front door, the metal groaning on rusted hinges, and stepped inside. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of mold and pine. Dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through the dirty windows. Her flashlight beam cut a narrow path across the main room, revealing a stone fireplace, a sagging couch, and an old wooden table. The house was silent, but there was a tension in the air, like it was holding its breath. She set down her bag, trying to shake off the feeling, and decided to start a fire. The fireplace hadn't been used in decades. As she scraped together dry kindling, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow? Maybe it was just the clouds blocking the last rays of sun. She told herself to relax, that she was imagining things. But when she turned back to the fireplace, she noticed a single footprint in the dust near the door. She froze. It was fresh. She scanned the room. Empty. Her heart started racing. She chalked it up to nerves, though every rational thought in her mind screamed otherwise. She locked the door behind her and sat near the fireplace, trying to light a fire, but the matches kept going out. She finally managed a small flame, the fire hissing as it caught on the old wood. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering like they had a life of their own. Hours passed. She ate a cold sandwich from her bag, feeling increasingly watched. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the old timbers made her jump. Around midnight, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows and whispering through the cracks. She wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to find comfort, but the feeling of being observed only intensified. Then she heard it, a soft tapping from upstairs. At first, she thought it was a branch against the window. Then it came again, steady, deliberate. Footsteps. Upstairs. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was impossible. She was alone. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly crept up the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The hall at the top was dark, the beam of her light cutting across old photographs of her family. Then she saw it, a shadow moving at the far end of the hallway, just beyond her light's reach. She froze. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The shadow didn't move. She stepped closer. The air grew colder, her breath visible in front of her. Then a door at the end of the hall creaked open. It was her grandmother's old bedroom, the one she had avoided as a child. The door swung slowly on its hinges, revealing the room shrouded in darkness. And then she saw her, a woman standing by the window, back to Sarah, unmoving. Her hair hung long and dark, and her dress looked faded like it had belonged to another century. Sarah's throat went dry. "Grandma?" she whispered. The figure turned slowly. Her face was pale, unnervingly so, eyes wide and hollow, mouth slightly open as if trying to speak but unable. Sarah stumbled back, tripping over the carpet, her flashlight skittering across the floor. The beam landed on the woman again, now closer, her feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Sarah ran. She didn't know where. Back down the stairs, into the main room, and toward the door. She yanked it open. The porch was empty. The night was black, the wind howling, branches scraping against the cabin like claws. She ran to her car, fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking violently. As she started the engine, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow standing at the edge of the woods, watching her. The drive down the narrow mountain road was worse than the night itself. Fog rolled in thick, headlights barely penetrating it. Every turn seemed endless, every shadow between the trees a potential threat. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the shadow to follow. Nothing came, but the feeling of being hunted never left. When she finally reached the town, she pulled into a 24-hour diner, desperate for light and warmth. She sat in a corner booth, shaking, staring out the window at the road behind her. She noticed the waitress watching her curiously. "Rough night?" she asked. Sarah forced a laugh. "You have no idea." The waitress frowned but didn't press. Sarah stayed there until the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon. When she finally drove home, she tried to put the night behind her. But sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pale face, the hollow eyes, the slow, deliberate movements. Weeks passed. She told herself it was a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion. But then came the calls. At first, just silence. Then breathing. Heavy, ragged, and always on the other end of the line. She changed her number, blocked calls, but they continued. One night, she returned from work to find her apartment door unlocked. Nothing inside was disturbed, but the air smelled like the cabin, cold, damp, moldy. And on the living room wall, written in what looked like condensation, were the words, "I've missed you." She left immediately, staying with friends, but every place she went felt temporary. She started noticing shadows in corners, flashes of movement out of the corner of her eye, whispers just loud enough to make her pause. Every reflective surface, the windows of buses, mirrors in stores, shiny countertops, sometimes held her reflection, and another figure standing just behind her. Her friends noticed the change. Sarah was jumpy, paranoid, exhausted. She stopped going out at night, stopped answering her phone, stopped sleeping. Her world became a haze of fear and shadows. One evening, nearly 2 months after the cabin, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden figurine of a woman, hand-carved, eerily resembling the figure from the cabin. Along with it, a note, "You can't run." Terrified, she considered calling the police, but thought better of it. What would she tell them? That a ghost or something far worse was stalking her? They'd call her insane. She couldn't tell anyone. She had no one. The nights became unbearable. Sleep was a dangerous territory. She was always afraid of what would appear in the darkness. Sometimes she awoke to find the figurine moved, closer to her bed than before. Sometimes she'd wake to hear a soft whisper in her ear, the words indistinct but full of malice. She started documenting everything, each sighting, every sound, every movement of the figurine. But the more she wrote, the more it seemed to follow her, always finding new ways to intrude. Her apartment became a prison, her life reduced to hiding and waiting. One night, she woke to complete darkness, the power out. She reached for her phone and the flashlight flickered on, and there she was, standing at the foot of her bed, just as she remembered. Pale, hollow eyes, long dark hair, her presence filling the room with suffocating cold. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as the figure reached out. But this time, there was no escape, no running, no light, no reprieve. The figure leaned close, and Sarah could feel its icy breath, could hear the whisper, clear this time, "You're home now." The world collapsed into darkness, and Sarah understood then that some places, some nights, some things were not meant to be left behind. They followed, they waited, they never let go. The police found the apartment the next day, door locked from the inside. Sarah was gone. No signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, only the figurine, now sitting on her nightstand, staring at the empty bed with its hollow eyes. Neighbors whispered about strange noises in the building at night. Some claimed to see a woman in a pale dress staring from the windows. Maintenance workers reported sudden cold spots, whispers in empty hallways. The building became known for its haunted apartment, but no one dared enter, and Sarah's disappearance faded into local legend, just another story about the dangers of isolation and curiosity. Yet sometimes long after dark, if you walk past the building on a windy night, you can see her in the window, watching, waiting, still trapped in the shadows of a night that was too evil to ever end. Storyden.